Chapter 30. A well-made dish and good food. 1. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 30. A well-made dish and good food. 1. It would be cruelty for the losers, but at least, Grand Chef treated its winners really well. Right now, it was the same on using fresh ingredients. All the participants, excluding the disqualified ones, could use fresh ingredients without restrictions. A pantry that had almost all of the ingredients excluding foie gras and shark fin. The ingredients warehouse was no different to heaven for those who liked to cook. It was an obvious thing for the participants to grab the knife a couple of times in a day. They made experiments without holding back, and those experiments were eaten by the broadcasting crew, but were mostly eaten by themselves. And that was the reason Chloe wanted to cry. What can I do? I think I got fatter. Chloe said that while grabbing her belly fat. Jo Min-jun looked at her as if he couldn't understand her. Because in his eyes, she just looked slim. Because of her lightly tanned skin, her body seemed as resilient as a black person. However, Jo Min-jun didn't particularly point that out. Because he knew well that whenever you talked about weight with a girl, there would be nothing to gain with that. But Marco didn't seem to be like him. He looked at Chloe with a dumbfounded expression. You got fatter. Chloe looked back at Marco and put an awkward face. Marco's barrel-like body that was seated on a sofa, made it look like it was a bath chair. To complain about her weight next to him. It was at that moment. Next to them a grumbling voice could be heard. If she says that she got fatter, then she did. Does she have to get as fat as you to say that she gained weight? It was Kaya. She opened her mouth with her usual cold expression. Only, she wasn't looking at Marco but was looking at her handphone screen. Seeing that her eyes twitched at times, she was probably reading comments about her. Chloe sat in the sofa's arm and started to massage Kaya. Why don't you stop reading the comments? That's not good for your mental health. It's okay. This much bad-mouthing is something I used to hear all the time. Jo Min-jun looked at Kaya and let out a sigh. Even after the first episode ended, she didn't check the comments about her like that. No, even if she did check, she did it with a lighter expression. However, she wasn't like that right now. To be precise, it was after yesterday's second episode got broadcasted. Grand Chef Episode 2 was about the qualifying processes in other regions. Probably, it was going to be like that until Episode 3. The important thing was the protagonist of Episode 2. Just like Kaya became the main character in Episode 1, Episode 2 protagonist was Anderson. And that was a method to originate fervor between the viewers. Kaya Lotus, who comes from the ghetto, and Anderson Rousseau, who grew from an elite chef's house. The color of the two participants were clearly different. It was the start of war. Kaya's fans bad-mouthed Anderson, and it was the same otherwise. In the end, both of the participants ended up getting hurt, but fandom tended to flow to the extreme. Jo Min-jun just looked at Kaya. She was still young, but she was already grown up. They say that you won't get any business in front of ill-natured comments, but Jo Min-jun believed that Kaya would accept that naturally. However, he didn't like that she kept on looking at the comments. Jo Min-jun said. It was a magic word that could make everyone to get up. Let's eat lunch. Lunch. It isn't even 11:30. It hasn't even been 3 hours since I had breakfast. If you keep cooking then you will get hungry. And Chloe, you are still slim. So there's no need to be like that. Let's go. Jo Min-jun talked like that and slightly glanced at Kaya. Kaya didn't seem to catch because she was busy looking at the smartphone, but Marco and Chloe understood Jo Min-jun's gaze. In the end, Marco let out a sigh and got that heavy body up from the sofa. What are we going to eat? The reason Marco, Chloe and Jo Min-jun got close was simple. Team mission. After that day, those three were always together. And it wasn't like that just for their team. Most of the participants tended to get along with the others they were together with on that day. However, Kaya was an exception among those. She couldn't help but be it. Because she ended up cooking a dish that wasn't favorable for the team on a team mission. And even people that weren't with her on the same team couldn't help but find it burdensome. In the end, Kaya became no different than a loner. The reason Kaya grouped with Jo Minjun's team was unexpectedly not because of Jo Minjun, but because of Chloe. Jo Minjun was worried about Kaya's pride and couldn't even get near her, but Chloe approached her with her unique bright attitude. She got rejected and approached her. Got rejected once more and approached her once again. Chloe's personality is really good. It was to the point that she made you think that. Chloe was steady. She seemed like someone who couldn't just leave alone someone who had just gotten hurt. Perhaps, it could be consideration because she teamed up with Jo Minjun. The result of that repeating many times is what you see right now. A lunch that was being cooked by people holding a pan like a family. Jo Minjun rather enjoyed this situation. Those four were standing in the kitchen and each making a dish. It was a method that was copied from the course cooking sloppily. Jo Minjun made aglio e olio, Chloe made potato soup, Kaya was in charge of grilled scallops. And it was souffle for Marco. Aglio e olio was a simple dish and varied depending on the chef. Olive oil acted instead of the sauce, so the noodles' texture, salt seasoning and the strength of the aroma was clearly differentiated. It was a dish that wasn't roughly made unlike with tomato sauce. Of course, it was a really comfortable dish to challenge in making because the ingredients used were only olive oil, garlic, cayenne pepper and spaghetti noodles. The reason Koreans made aglio e olio first and the most was because of that reason. While making a dish you weren't accustomed to, it was natural to think about using cheaper ingredients thinking that you could fail the dish. It was also through cooking pasta that Jo Minjun earnestly got the hang of cooking. Precisely speaking, it was through aglio e olio. And that was quite a good lesson. Because you could approach more analytically about the inherent flavor of the oil, and the aroma of the garlic, cayenne pepper and etc. Jo Minjun poured oil and salt in the boiling water. The salt was to season the noodles, and the olive oil was for the noodles to not get sticky. And then, took out the spaghetti noodles. Normally for Koreans, when they thought about pasta, they would think about spaghetti. And it was also the most suitable noodle to make aglio e olio. If you used a flat and long noodle like fettuccine, then the greasy flavor of the oil was felt strongly. There weren't different kind of pastas for no reason. Jo Minjun put in the spaghetti in the boiling water. His mood got better while looking at the noodles spread like a petal. He put aside the boiling pot and took out some garlic. When Koreans made aglio e olio, the biggest difference was the amount of garlic used. If you took into account the love for garlic, then Korea was a country that didn't get pushed back by any other country. However, it wasn't the traditional way to cook aglio e olio. For aglio e olio, it was 1 clove of garlic per person. But there were many cases where Koreans used not 1 clove, but the whole garlic. It was because they couldn't enjoy boring flavors. Because Korean cuisine was characterized for its strong flavor. And fortunately, Jo Minjun considered that he was overseas. The garlic cloves he sliced were exactly 3. Even before the spaghetti got properly cooked, Jo Minjun heated the pan and poured a good amount of olive oil. And then, put the garlic and pepper and started to cook it. And at that moment, the noodles were cooked perfectly to the al dente state. If it was compared to meat, then it would be medium rare. Jo Minjun used a sieve to throw the water and separate the noodle. Then took a spoonful of the used water and mixed it. If you poured the used water like this, it seasoned it a bit, but it also enabled the oil to mix well with the noodles. There were times that you didn't put in water, but that was because the noodles were watery enough. When the water boiled down a bit, he put in a bright red peperoncino pepper. Based on the person they would fry garlic together with pepper, but Jo Minjun didn't like that flavor. It was a good method to save the flavor if you fried the noodles at the same time. At this point it was almost completed. Jo Min-jun opened his mouth. I'm almost done, what about you? The scallops are also almost done. But I'm going to finish cooking it with a torch so it doesn't matter. Kaya's voice could be heard. Jo Min-jun opened his mouth once again. Chloe, and you. I'm going to finish at the same time you complete your dish. Even so, you need to cool down aglio e olio. I think that it would be fine to eat it at that time. He didn't particularly ask Marco. The meringue dough that was going to be used for the souffle was already made beforehand, so if you put it in the oven at the right time, then it was over. However, Marco was preparing in case he also got a question, but seeing that nothing was heard, he put a long face and hanged his head down. Of course, it was a situation Jo Min-jun couldn't see. He turned off the burner's fire that was burning weakly, and shook the pan once. The slippery noodles seemed quite delicious. He started serving the noodles in 4 dishes, and sprinkled parsley powder. People used to simply think that parsley powder was used for decoration, but unexpectedly, parsley powder was an herb that had a thick aroma. It was also a herb that couldn't be out of aglio e olio. He didn't put Parmesan cheese. Putting cheese in aglio e olio was a debatable problem even overseas. Compared to Korea, it was similar to putting egg in ramen or not. That's why he put the Parmesan cheese in a separate bowl. Jo Min-jun looked at the aglio e olio. Unfortunately, the cooking score was 6. He let out a sigh. It was difficult to get 7 points without using a special recipe. Nowadays, he started to get more thoughts about cooking skills. It was because the 7 points recipe, when cooked by Kaya, became an 8 points dish. Of course, it was meaningless to envy a skill he didn't have yet. Jo Min-jun opened his mouth. I'm done. Me too. Chloe laughed and brought the whole pot. It would be quite a weird sight for those who didn't know much about Western culture. Because they don't allow many hands going for one dish because it's unhygienic. But putting the pot in the middle and serving themselves was quite common for Westerners. At least, the United States was like that. There were many cases where they served the spaghetti with tongs. Jo Min-jun looked at the soup. And at that moment, he couldn't help but get perplexed. The cooking score was being shown. But the score was weird. Maybe there was a mistake with the system, or even if there wasn't a problem, it was a score that didn't convince him. Chloe tilted her head and asked puzzled. What, why are you looking like that? No, it's nothing much. Jo Min-jun smiled awkwardly and replied. However, there were still many doubts left in front of his eyes. Chloe's potato soup was 6 points. A well-made dish and good food, 1, end translator. Subak proofreader. Mailed. Chapter 31. A well-made dish and good food, 2, you are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 31. A well-made dish and good food, 2, of course, considering that Chloe's cooking level was 7, it wasn't weird for a 6 points dish to appear. Because if her condition was bad, that kind of dish could be made. But taking that into account, there seemed to be no dissatisfaction on Chloe's face. Because if she knew that she had failed, there would be no way she didn't put on a disappointed face. And Chloe wasn't such a bad chef as to not differentiate whether she had failed her dish or not. That's why it was more confusing for Jo Min-jun. How could she have such a light face after making a 6 points dish? Jo Min-jun looked at the soup with doubting eyes. It was at that moment. Someone touched Jo Min-jun's back from behind. What are you doing and not seating? It was Kaya. She served the grilled scallops directly on a plate. So on the table were placed the soup, pasta and the main dish, the scallops. It could be said that it was closer to a Korean formal dinner than a coarse cooking. They were eating by themselves, so there was no need to keep the order of the serving. Jo Min-jun sat on the place. Marco put the dough in the oven and opened his mouth while walking towards the table. It looks like a buffet. Kaya smiled without saying a word. And Jo Minjun looked at her dish. Maybe it was made with her usual skills, but her grilled scallops was 7 points. The exterior of it was seared like a custard pudding applied with butter. However, what Jo Minjun ate first was the potato soup. In the first place, this dish had the main role, so it was an obvious thing to eat it first. The soup wasn't as thick as cream soup, but rather it was like Korean gamja ong simi or samjitang's soup. When he drank a spoonful of the brownish soup, the clear flavor and the scallion's aroma roamed around the mouth. It was tasty. But just that. A flavor where you seem to have tried it elsewhere. It wasn't subtle nor strong, but the flavor was just at the middle of those. Wow, Chloe! This is delicious. At the voice of Kaya, Jo Minjun couldn't help but get surprised. Kaya was the type to not talk much, but she was also worse at doing compliments. That's why when Jo Minjun saw that the soup was 6 points, he thought that Kaya would surely talk bad about the dish. However, the results were the opposite. Jo Minjun drank the soup with a dumbfounded face. This time, he also ate the mashed potato along with buttercups. It was just that much. It was good to eat it as a meal, but the strong impression of Chloe couldn't be felt as usual. And at that moment, Jo Minjun thought. Why must I feel impressed by a dish? Maybe he was thinking about useless things. Thinking about it, Korean meat restaurants didn't receive those high points. Remembering the times when he was in Korea, he remembered that they were mostly 5 or 6 points. But it didn't mean that the meat wasn't delicious. There was no one that was dissatisfied with the meat. It was good food. Although it was just roasted meat to say that it was cooking, but there would be nobody that would say that it wasn't food. At that point, Jo Minjun started to question the scoring system. At first, he thought that it was a system that scored the points of a food, like the name implied. But would that score represent everything of that dish? Because he thought like that, the word cooking started to bother him. Minjun. Why that expression? Is it not tasty? Jo Minjun, that was immersed in his thoughts for a while, woke up by Chloe's voice. She was checking him with a worried face. Jo Minjun laughed awkwardly. In that instant, many things passed through his head. It was about wanting to express honestly or not. But if it was about this, he thought that it would be better to just let it pass. Because it wasn't just another thing, it was about cooking. Besides, he wondered that the reason Chloe got disqualified early on despite having good skills would be because of this. Jo Minjun opened his mouth. It is tasty. But honestly speaking, it's just that. Of course, judging your dish this seriously between us is not so good, but I get a bit of regret. At the same time, I'm a bit confused. It is certainly not a professional dish. But despite that, I don't get the feeling that it lacks something. Is it not good like this? The one who replied to him wasn't Chloe, it was Kaya. She was licking her spoon like a candy, and continued speaking. It's simple and good. To add this and that to this dish would just make it excessive. I also think like that. But it's disappointing. Chloe. Cooking right here is for us to eat, but also to practice. Doesn't that mean that you are planning to cook this kind of dish in the next mission? That's right, but, is it no good? Chloe tilted her head and asked. He didn't want to say something bad to someone with such an honest face, but he had to do so because he was her friend. It was necessary for the survival of Chloe. Jo Minjun opened his mouth. It's hard to say, but first I'll evaluate it. If you ask me about how I think about your dish, then I'm satisfied. And I'll probably be able to eat it once a day and pretty deliciously at that. But if you ask me if this is the utmost of your skills, then my answer is no. Even if a chef with good skills puts frozen food in the microwave, then the result will be average. I think that it would be the same for this potato soup recipe. No, the potato soup itself. What you are trying to tell me? So it's this. That potato soup is not a good dish to show my abilities with. At least this potato soup is like that. It's not that it's tasty for the mouth, it is just eaten well. I think that it is closer to a familiar meal than coarse cooking. At those words, Chloe fell deep in her thoughts while touching her lips. Rather than saying that his words hurt her, it was more than a homework from her. But it was also a homework for Jo Min-jun. Actually, while Jo Min-jun was sharing his opinions with her, his voice wasn't filled with confidence. It was because of the cooking score that appeared before. That's why it got all the more harder to reply for Chloe. Then, is potato soup a dish that shouldn't be served in any restaurant? Because it doesn't let you show your full skills or give a professional flavor. At that moment, Jo Min-jun couldn't think of anything to reply. Was that really the case? Would a dish with no hope of improvement be served in a restaurant? If there was, then who decided on that rule? Jo Min-jun couldn't think of an answer. There was a time where he worked on a restaurant, but it was as the youngest chef. Only the word was chef, but actually there was no difference to being in charge of chores. There weren't many things he knew to pierce through a restaurant's physiology. Saying the truth, Jo Min-jun wanted to agree at what Chloe had said. If there was a limit to cooking, and the limit to cooking would be decided because of that. He thought that it was a really sad thing. It was the same like saying that every person, when born, would have different value with others. I don't know. In the end, what Jo Min-jun could say was just that. But Chloe didn't blame him for answering like that. Rather, she smiled brightly. It was a hospitable smile. It was a Chloe-like face. Then let's think together. We have plenty of time. Yeah. Let's. First, let's eat the pasta. At this rate, it won't get cool, but will get soggy. Chloe smiled and raised her fork. Jo Min-jun smiled faintly and brought the aglio e olio he had made to his mouth. The flavor was a success. The spaghetti that was mixed with oil gave a subtle garlic aroma along with the hot peperoncino flavor. And the main point was the saltiness. Personally, Jo Min-jun thought that the main point on giving flavor to the aglio e olio was salt. The feeling where you could vaguely feel the saltiness. It was a flavor which Koreans were bored with. But Jo Min-jun thought that if they were participants to come to Grand Chef, then they would be able to feel this profound flavor amply. Indeed, on Chloe's face, a faint smile could be seen. It's a flavor that pushes and pulls. I just made it to be like that. A fluttering flavor. That kind of sensation. Marco. What about you? Honestly speaking, it needs more seasoning for me. I used to eat salty food. Then put in some cheese that's over there. Then it will suit you. I was about to. Marco wiped the sweat on his forehead and put some cheese in it. At that moment, the aroma of the cheese tickled his nose. Even if he was putting it in his dish, it was that much. Could it be the power of cheese? Jo Min-jun ignored the temptation coming from a corner of his heart and rolled the noodles in his fork. Aglio e olio becomes an entirely different dish in front of cheese. He wanted to keep believing that. It's lacking. Kaya suddenly said. But Jo Min-jun didn't get surprised. Because it was pretty normal for her to be grumbling in front of food. Rather, he was happy about her reaction. Her incredible tasting was a better ability than Jo Min-jun's system. Only she could grasp the entirety of the flavor's structure after eating it. Jo Min-jun asked. What is lacking? Entire balance. I think that there's a lot of parsley powder in it, and the noodles and the oil aren't perfectly in sync. You should have poured more water. You made it too hurriedly. I'll keep it in mind. He didn't feel bad. There would be cases where you started to hate the person that pointed out your mistakes. But Kaya was well aware of that, and pointed out things for Jo Min-jun. Thinking about that, he couldn't feel bad. At least, he wasn't someone with a small mind. But at the same time he couldn't help but question it a little. They were both 6 points dishes. Chloe's potato soup, and Jo Min-jun's aglio e olio. But why didn't she point out anything about the potato soup, but pointed out the regretful parts of his aglio e olio? However, his question didn't last long. It couldn't. Kaya asked them with an anxious voice. Then start slowly eating my dish too. The flavor will get dispersed. Kaya looked at her scallops anxiously as if she was looking at a bedridden old man. Jo Min-jun laughed and put a scallop in his mouth. The flavor was obviously delicious. Because Kaya's skills didn't run off to somewhere. In the case of scallops, if it got a little cold, then the flavor could be felt more clearly. The butter that was slightly about to get hard melting in one's mouth, and the soft scallop like that woman's lips were all satisfactory. Kaya asked with shining eyes. How is it? It's like always. There's nothing to point out. Jo Min-jun shrugged his shoulders and said. Kaya looked at Marco and Chloe. Chloe didn't say anything and just smiled. It meant that it was delicious. At that moment Marco opened his mouth. Kaya got nervous and looked at him. However, what Marco said wasn't related to her dish. I will now bring the souffle. It should be done. When Marco said that and came back, there was a chocolate souffle with white sugar powder that was like snow on his hands. Chloe said admiration words. Wow, Marco. Your breads are perfect even from the smell. Why did you come to Grand Chef? You should have gone to a Grand Party City or something of the sort. But it doesn't exist. Marco said hopelessly. And then, sliced the souffle with a cake knife and served it on each plate. Jo Min-jun got surprised while looking at the souffle. It was a quality he hadn't seen in a while. 8 points. Souffle was a really simple dish, but just like aglio e olio, the difference of the flavor was like heaven and earth depending on the chef. No, in this case it was the pastry chef. It also meant that this dish was perfect to properly show Marco's skills. How would it taste like? Jo Min-jun sliced a piece of the souffle with his fork. It was so soft to the point it couldn't even be compared to sponge cake, and while it was being ripped, it released hot steam. The steam was filled with chocolate aroma. Jo Min-jun brought that to his mouth slowly. The sweet and soft flavor that roams through his mouth. It was a little bit sour and sticky, and that flavor that was felt through his tongue conquered his mouth. What he could do right now was laughing happily. Suddenly, the worry about the scoring method was now far away. A well-done dish and good food, too. End translator. Subak proofreader. Mailed. Chapter 32. A well-made dish and good food, 3. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 32. A well-made dish and good food, 3. He couldn't get asleep. Jo Min-jun closed his eyes trying to sleep, but ended up opening them. He glanced at his handphone and it was already midnight. He buried his face on the pillow, and in the end stood up from the place. He thought that laying like this would be wasting time. The reason he didn't get sleepy was simple. Because of the case of the low score. Precisely speaking, it was a little different than the score. It was about the limits of cooking. Chloe's potato soup was perfect. If she added something more, then that dish would become something else. But would that potato soup remain as a sloppy 6 points? Stats window. Jo Min-jun, cooking level. 6 baking level. 4 tasting level. 7 decorations level. 5 Jo Min-jun kept looking at his stat window. Excluding the decorations level that went up by 1 when he teamed up with Kaya, there was nothing different. Level 7. When will I reach it? As he was mumbling, Jo Min-jun's face froze. Since when did he start to care about his level this much? He started to think that at one point, the dishes he made weren't for cooking, but for raising his cooking level. But he couldn't help but be like that. He was different to Chloe or Kaya. He couldn't ignore the score that was being shown in front of him. Even so, the potato soup, he started to remember the flavor. It was thick and stable. It was well cooked, so there wasn't even a trace of a bad smell coming from the potato. And also the buttercup aroma. Even though it wasn't splendid, it was delicious. It was fun. Also, Kaya, who reached the top level 10 in tasting, didn't point anything wrong with the dish. Was it because it was the best the potato soup could get? Or because the potato soup itself was a good dish? The cooking score was perfect for the system. How much creativity was used while cooking that dish, how stably a skill was used, how harmonious the ingredients became, etc. It was a score taking into account all of that. A dish with high cooking score was certainly a good dish. However, a dish with a low cooking score was a bad one. Zhou Minjun couldn't stop thinking about that. Zhou Minjun let out a sigh. His head hurt. And the way he relieved stress was quite simple. To eat. He opened the door, and the hallway was really dark. Zhou Minjun walked the hallway guided by the flashlight of his handphone. His destination was the pantry, and the kitchen. As he reached the kitchen, there was an unexpected guest. It was Anderson. It seemed like he was making some gravy. He put onions, pumpkins, etc. in the boiling water and looked at Zhou Minjun. Zhou Minjun waved his hand expressionlessly. Hi. What are you doing here? What do you mean? I came to cook. Zhou Minjun replied as if he was being asked something obvious. Anderson didn't particularly like Zhou Minjun, but it was also the same otherwise. After the first broadcast ended and after what Zhou Minjun said about Kaya winning, he still remembered what Anderson had told him back then. He was beating around the bush, but in the end it meant that first, he had to have some skills to talk. Of course, Zhou Minjun understood the hidden meaning. He wasn't someone who liked people that disliked him. The conversation ended with just that. Zhou Minjun went to the pantry and looked for ingredients. Instead of saying that he wanted to practice cooking, he needed food to fill his belly. He wanted to make some kimchi jjigae with pork mak sao, but there was no kimchi in the pantry. Should I ask for it later? He thought like that, but it was pointless. Although it was a representing item in Korea, it didn't work in the world. Precisely speaking, only half of it worked. The reason was because of the fishy smell left. In conclusion, it was a difficult ingredient to use in this kind of competition. Even if he did ask for some kimchi, in the end, he was going to use it to make the things he used to eat. To ask some to eat by himself was being a nuisance. Because he couldn't make kimchi jjigae, the next thing he thought of was doenjang jjigae. In the pantry, there were all kinds of things related to condiments of the whole world. There was of course doenjang. Although a commercial one of course, but the flavor wasn't bad. Rather, Zhou Minjun favored commercial doenjang. Compared to the homemade ones, its color was lighter, and the flavor was as light as the color. When cooking doenjang jjigae with commercial doenjang, there was only one disadvantage. That the more you cooked it, the more flavor it lost. However, it was a disadvantage he didn't need to take into account when you were going to eat it once like this time. Zhou Minjun handled the anchovies. To say that he was going to handle it, it was a rather simple process. To remove the dung and the guts. Depending on whether you did this or not, the sour flavor changed drastically. And Zhou Minjun wasn't the type to roughly prepare what he was going to eat. The next step after handling the anchovies was simple. To put the anchovies and kelp in the water, boil it and make the gravy. Depending on the person, they could fry meat to make the gravy, but Zhou Minjun didn't like the combination of doenjang jjigae and meat. He didn't like the flavor of the doenjang to be contaminated with the oil coming out from the meat. It was his philosophy that doenjang jjigae needed to be cool and clean. Joe Minjun chopped the radish, onions, potatoes, pumpkin, mushrooms and tofu to the size of dices. Anderson glanced at him and asked. What are you making? Doenjang jjigae. Do you know about it? No. Looking at the ingredient, it looks like Japanese miso soup. Is it tasty? I wonder. I don't think that it will suit your tastes. Joe Minjun replied displeased. Korean people couldn't notice it, but people around the world felt the flavor to be really thick. It was also the same when they tried the sweet and light Japanese doenjang jjigae. So would they like the Korean one? He wondered if Anderson would enjoy doenjang jjigae. Anderson didn't keep talking to him. Joe Minjun took out the anchovies and the kelp and put in the doenjang and chili powder. When the soup was moderately done, he put in the vegetables he sliced. And after he boiled it for some time, putting the tofu and sliced green chili was the end. The doenjang jjigae was completed. The score was 6 points. However, he didn't mind. In the first place, it wasn't a dish made hoping that it ends with a good score. In the first place, cooking doenjang jjigae with commercial doenjang was difficult to get a high score. Even getting 6 points was good enough. It was at that moment when he put the instantaneous rice in the microwave. Anderson came to him and opened his mouth. Let's share. What? You even shared the catfish dish with Kaya. Why, you don't want to with me? Rather than I don't want to. You don't like me that much. Joe Minjun didn't hit around the bush and answered directly. Anderson shrugged his shoulders. It's true that I don't like you. But there's no reason to not like your dish. That doenjang jjigae thing, it's the first time I see it. And I have to eat what I see for the first time to ease my curiosity. If you say it like that. Then bring yours too. At those words Anderson laughed. Mine is going to taste better. Won't you get discouraged by it? You have to try it to know. Joe Minjun replied while snorting. Actually, he had the rights to act like that. Because Anderson's dish, the tomato chicken stew, was merely 6 points. Joe Minjun and Anderson sat on a table facing each other. The first thing Joe Minjun ate was the doenjang jjigae. The flavor of the doenjang jjigae he didn't eat for a while was exceptional. Because of the chili powder and the green chili, it was spicy. And the unique coolness of the anchovy gravy passed through his throat cleanly. The flavor of eating tofu, pumpkin and soup along with rice was perfect. Honestly speaking, it was incomparable to the dishes of Chloe and Kaya. And now, Joe Minjun ate the tomato chicken stew. The aroma of butter could be felt in the soup, and the sweet flavor of the tomato could be felt. The main point of tomato chicken stew was saving the sweet flavor, and this stew was one that was really sweet. However, it wasn't in the level of the doenjang jjigae he just ate. Of course, it was the same for Anderson. Anderson frowned after trying the doenjang jjigae. It doesn't feel fresh. It's that kind of dish. It would be a difficult dish to use in a mission. About that. Joe Minjun opened his mouth. Anderson flinched when he looked at Joe Minjun that seemed to want to talk about something serious. The dishes in a top restaurant. So the dishes made with the best technique and ingredients, and normal homemade food. Will you be able to evaluate both of the dishes? No, I'll speak more directly. What holds more value and what doesn't? What are you talking about so suddenly? I just thought of that. That what people use to eat isn't made by professional skills nor thought about the harmony of the ingredients. But just because of that do they hold no value? I'm curious. Anderson didn't reply. He just looked at Joe Minjun. Joe Minjun took one more spoon of the doenjang jjigae and looked at it. And talked in a silent voice. Suddenly, my mind is a mess. If a well-made dish is good food, no, it's not. Precisely speaking, a dish made without outstanding skills can become good food. It's confusing. Anderson didn't say a thing and fell in his thoughts. It seemed that it wasn't an easy question to answer. However, when he opened his mouth, the words that flowed through his lips were quite deep. If it was delicious for the person eating it, then isn't that good food? Ha! It's like the hot dog made in the streets. If the person that ate it says that it was delicious, then it is good food. Of course, I know that what you are trying to say is a little different. I know that you are not talking about the idea, but about the quality. But I think that the basis is that. Look at this. Anderson pointed the table in front of him. A tomato chicken stew, and doenjang jjigae. It was a simple table. We can make even more luxurious and splendid dishes. But we are eating these simple dishes. And it won't be different for an Epicurean. The person who checked the searing point of a steak in a top restaurant, could be eating frozen pizza and think that it is delicious. But you can't place that frozen pizza on a dish. Of course not. In the afternoon I tried Chloe's potato soup. It was delicious. But I thought that it was a dish that couldn't be presented in a top-class restaurant. Because it lacked splendor. It would be better to cook it with one's family. It was a good dish. Even so, it can't be presented in a top restaurant, isn't it weird? It is delicious, it certainly is delicious food, hold on. Anderson raised his hand and interrupted him. Joe Minjun looked at him. Anderson spoke with his usual calm face. Aren't you mistaken about something? What? The flavor isn't it all in cooking. It's just a part of it. The shape, ingredients. At times, the ingredients fees, the chef's fame, interior, all of that is included at what the customers pay for. But, a dish that contains potato soup you usually eat. Do you think that it will be able to please them? Joe Minjun couldn't reply back. Anderson continued. It must be a dish that can't be imitated at home. And the better the quality of the ingredients, then, the better. The reason cooking is not the same as homemade cooking is because of that. Homemade cooking can be done by anyone if they practice a little. Then how do you think the flavor is given? Isn't that a question that can be answered just by looking at this table? At those words, Joe Minjun looked at the doenjang jjigae and tomato chicken stew. He was staring for a while and soon, Joe Minjun smiled brightly. Yes. That's right. A well-done dish and good food are completely different things. He started to think about many things in his head. The naengmyeon, he ate after finishing his finals, or the tonkatsu, he ate when he got admitted to the army, the jelly made by Jesse. It wasn't that he realized it just now. He knew it all along. Just that he wasn't conscious of it. Looking at the system score, he forgot what cooking meant, and what was food. The cooking score was in the end, the technique used while cooking. If a better technique was used, then the quality of the food and the level couldn't be helped but be high. So it couldn't be helped that the quality of the food and the level of it was almost similar. Only then could Joe Minjun realize it. The situation wasn't any different. This was Grand Chef. It was a place where he showed his skills, and the dish with high cooking score could get good compliments. However, Joe Minjun's way of thinking changed. Just because the cooking score was low, it didn't mean that it was bad. Of course, while the cooking score was higher, the flavor would get more complex and more refined. Because cooking techniques existed for that. But just because it wasn't complex, and wasn't refined didn't mean that it was bad. Just like how he yearned for doenjang jjigae right now, at times, that simplicity reached even deeper. Perhaps, a 5-points dish could taste better than the 10-points dish. Joe Minjun stood up. He walked towards Anderson and shook his hand. Anderson looked at Joe Minjun with a perplexed face. Joe Minjun said seriously. Thank you. Anderson. I really thank you. It was a good counseling. What? So suddenly, I think that I would be able to sleep well. I say it once again but, thank you. I won't forget about today. Jo Min-jun talked like that and left the place. Anderson looked confusedly at the back of Jo Min-jun. After a while, his eyes looked back at the table. Anderson grumbled. At least wash the dishes, crazy bastard, a well-done dish and good food, 3, end translator. Subak proofreader. Mailed. Chapter 33. A dish made by a chef, 1, you are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 33. A dish made by a chef, 1, in Kaya's childhood, there was not even a spoon worth of peace. Also she didn't have a father. Her mother, Grace, said that her father left the house when she was young. And when Kaya became 6 years old, a man appeared next to Grace. She doesn't remember all the details, only that his eyes were shockingly deep and blue. Grace said that he was her father. Because Grace's eyes were brown, and Kaya's were blue, she didn't even doubt that he was her real father. Of course, that trust didn't get her any rewards. One day, that fake father fought with Grace inside the house and broke all of the furnitures, and after that, he didn't show himself. He had left. After leaving a living being inside the mother's womb. She doesn't remember the details, but she did remember that Grace was really sensitive and suffering at that moment. Maybe, the existence of Kaya was what drove her to keep working for her sake, but was she not enough? Kaya still remembered the scene where her mother was crying alone with her face buried on a pillow in a dark room. And at some time, the thing that soothed Grace wasn't her tears, but alcohol. Fortunately there were no injections. She would mostly drink cheap beer until she fell asleep because of the alcohol. Was it because of the alcohol? Or was it because of the bad luck that followed her everywhere? The child Grace gave birth to after the intense pain, Kaya's sister, was disabled. Cerebral paralysis. Looking at that child who couldn't even move her body as she wanted, no, that couldn't even make a proper expression, she felt that her world was being painted with dirty ink. After coming back from elementary school, she had to go to the market instead of her house. It wasn't that she hated that. Just like any child from any unlucky family, Kaya too, couldn't help but mature early on. She was poor and didn't have any proper skills, and her mother that wasn't even selling things, but was cleaning the market. A disabled sister that if left alone, would have no way to live on. To grumble about her life, reality was too harsh. But not because of that did she take life as a happy thing. It was a life where she was resigned to live properly and was being dragged. Her character was harsh, and her mouth was foul. Looking at the annoyed faces of the merchants, and looking at her friends of the same age running and playing, the awl in her heart got sharper. And that all even made her drop out from middle school. The only thing I can properly do is cooking. In front of the camera, Kaya Lotus was opening her mouth. Martin asked silently. How did you start cooking? I wanted to eat delicious things. Like I told you before, our house is poor. I brought back ingredients that couldn't be sold to the customers to the house and cooked them. At first, it was a shocking flavor. But fortunately, I had talent. Because I wanted to make the flavor at least a little bit better, I ran all around the place, and I got to know how to make it taste better. My mother and sister liked it. You must have been happy. Happy. Yes, of course I was happy. But putting aside all of those feelings, cooking was like a respirator for me. Precisely speaking, it was like that when I ate delicious food. Taking care of my ill sister, helping my mother, the illness that makes your body ache like an old man. And a bite of a delicious thing. I thought that was the only reason for me to live, it was a time that I could talk like that. Putting aside that she was talking about that calmly, its contents were dark. It couldn't even be said that it was an exaggeration. If you have lived that kind of life since small, then you could only think like that. I dropped out from middle school halfway. Because the medicine fee for my sister was really expensive and we were really tight on money with just that. In the first place, I wouldn't be able to go to college if I kept on going to school, so I just wanted to work. It must have been a difficult decision. Difficult decision. I wonder. The moment I dropped, I even felt a sense of freedom. Even so, that wasn't a place where I could be in. I wanted to rip people's mouths when they were in a bad mood just because of puberty when they didn't even have any kind of problems in their house. You saw Batman, right? The mouth of the Joker is ripped. Yeah, like that. Kaya pulled the end of her lips with her fingers and laughed while snapping it. Martin laughed and gave hand signals in his back. He had to cut that part. This excessive behavior wouldn't be accepted well by the viewers. Martin changed subjects. If it was this much about the past, then he had gotten enough. Is there anyone you are close with? No, Kaya replied without thinking for even a minute. Because of that, Martin couldn't help but get perplexed. He didn't think that she would obediently name someone, but for her to say that she didn't have any, that bluntly, he didn't even imagine it. Martin opened his mouth. No, isn't there some people you are close with? Like Marco, Minjun, Chloe. Aren't you close with them? Yes. I'm not. It was yet a firm answer. Martin laughed awkwardly and kept talking. No, why? Nowadays you are rather close. You eat together, and hang together. That's being close. Is the word close that light? At least we don't know a thing about each other, we have to perfectly trust each other to be close. Then does that mean that you are in the process of getting closer? That, Kaya frowned as if something was bothering her. Her bright lips were shut for a while, and then opened. However, the words that flowed through her weren't the words Martin had wanted. Let's go with another question. Is there a reason that it makes you difficult to answer? However, Martin was experienced. If you got a hold of something, there was no way you could let it go. Kaya looked at him for a minute. Kaya just glared at him. But a broadcasting PD was someone who had gone through all kinds of things and rose to that position. Martin's life also wasn't an easy one for a teen to look at him funnily. In the end, Kaya let out a sigh, and replied with a softer voice. Fine. I will talk. It's because it's embarrassing. You are at that age. To show affection to someone else, no. It's not that. Kaya interrupted Martin. Looking at the dumbfounded expression, Kaya bit her lips and said. The process of getting closer. I had many people being on that stage. 18, life seems short, but it's not really. I have met venomous people and also good people. The process of getting closer, I had it. And there's not a time where I did get close. Even though I pretended to be close, in the end, they all left. Martin couldn't reply anything back. He knew that at this moment, he had to ask something for the sake of the broadcast. But Kaya's eyes were really sad. She seemed like a little child that just became an adult. To ask her to reveal more of her past was a really cruel thing. Perhaps it's because they think that my character is poor, or there could be other things. Even so, the conclusion is the same. That I'm not someone who just gets close to anybody. But just because I say that we are a bit close right now, whether it's a process or not, it just gets messed up again. Martin and the author that was next to him couldn't say a thing. Kaya let out a smile. It was a provocative and confident smile, but Martin felt that smile to be empty. Saying that it's embarrassing, you got that right. After the interview ended, Kaya slowly walked towards the waiting room. She was quite sensitive for having shown a little bit of her hurt side. If she was like this, you wouldn't know if she would curse you from head to toe only by talking to her. In front of the waiting room, Kaya stopped her steps and opened her mouth. Calm down, Kaya Lotus. You came to get out of that swamp. You can do it. You are strong. Kaya stopped her mumbling. The door opened and Jo Minjun was coming out. Did he hear it? No, the door was closed. Was this door not able to block this much noise? Kaya glared at Joe Minjun. Joe Minjun flinched and looked at her. What? It's nothing. Kaya replied without strength and went inside the waiting room. Joe Minjun frowned a little and looked at her back. He was worried about her but he couldn't chase her back. Now was the time for the interviewing. As he was walking towards the interviewing room, the casting crew were really in a low mood. The female author was sniffing while wiping off her tears, and the cameraman's face was gloomier than ever. Joe Minjun sat on his place and asked Martin. What kind of interview was it that the atmosphere got this down? Well, we listened a bit of Kaya's story. You know about her past, right? Well, just the things that were broadcasted. Joe Minjun shrugged his shoulders and replied. Martin let out a sigh. Well, it's just like you see. We listened a bit more of her story. If you are sensible enough, it was a story you couldn't help but shed tears. Looking that you are fine, it seems that you aren't sensitive. How could I not be? It's just that my tears are lacking compared to my sensitivity. Joe Minjun smiled bitterly and shut his mouth. Martin also smiled and said. Right. Are you confident on the next mission? I must know what the mission is about to be able to say something. Honestly, saying something scares me. You don't know if I would get hit like last time after speaking some brief words. He was hitting around the bush, but he was talking about the ending of the first episode, about Kaya winning. Martin put an awkward face and scratched his head. Joe Minjun looked at him and said. You said that you wanted me to win, so I thought that even if you couldn't express it you would cheer for me in your heart. So was that a service announcement? I personally do cheer for you. However, I'm a PD. If you gave me such a good broadcasting material, it would be bad manners to not receive it. Martin said while smiling. He was a really wise guy. Joe Minjun stared at him for a while and soon laughed. Those are right words. I understand. Let's proceed with the interviewing. Minjun. The first episode was broadcasted and from one of the viewers' reaction there was something like this. Is there no way to be a success with cooking in Korea? Why did he come to the US? What do you think about this? I wonder. Personally speaking, I think that the first question is rather sensitive to answer. As for the latter, it's because of my selfishness and adoration. Looking at the past season of Grand Chef, I received admiration. I got a thought that I wanted to stand in this place. Because it's a good opportunity and a good stage. Even if that was the case, it's not normal to come all the way over here with just that as an excuse. The way I see it, you are the only case that I know that has come because of that. Because he was speaking like that, Joe Minjun got a thought that he was indeed a special case. Normally, if he chose the road to cooking, he wouldn't have come all the way to the US. Joe Minjun thought that the reason for that was because of his impatience and his craving. He also didn't want to be cleaning on a kitchen. The meaning wasn't that deep, but the motivation didn't need to be deep. I would be grateful if you thought of me like someone with passion. Well, then let's go with the next question. Then what about what you had said previously? About Kaya winning. You, sir, know about that. That there are more words to what I have said. If the person who had edited it asks me like that, then it's a bit troublesome. Oh, was there some more words? Martin made a quite surprised gesture and looked at Joe Minjun. Joe Minjun let out a sigh. I am going to win. I am determined to do so. Okay. I got it. Lately, you have been close to Chloe, Kaya and Marco. You got along quite well, but are you really close? I think we are. At least, that's what I think of. What was the trigger of you getting closer? I wonder. Kaya. For Kaya, I remember that we shared our dishes after the mission and got close after that. For Marco, we got close because we were both from New York, and for Chloe on the team mission. But this is not broadcasting material, is it? At those words, Martin smiled humorously. That's right. It's better for the interview to be more personal. With that meaning, Minjun, let's talk about your scandal. Scandal. It's a report from Mr. A. There's word that after you finished cooking, you passed on the dishes to wash. Is that true? Jo Minjun forced a laugh. I will make no comments about that. A dish made by a chef, 1, end translator. Subak proofreader. Mailed. Chapter 34. A dish from a chef, 2, you are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 34. A dish from a chef, 2, after the interview concluded, Jo Minjun went to the waiting room. Usually, he felt that the interviews were pointless, but today especially, he felt that it was even more so. Actually, a part of it was because he was thinking of other things. As soon as he opened the door, he looked for Kaya. However, she couldn't be seen anywhere. What he could actually see was Anderson's gloomy face. Jo Minjun grinned and said, "Hello, Mr. A. Shameless bastard. I apologized last time. It wasn't on purpose. No, would I pass it on to you after thanking you? In conclusion, you did." That's true, but, he had a gloomy face, but looking at him conversing well with Jo Minjun, the participants couldn't help but get surprised. Because he wasn't the kind of person to get along with the other participants. He could be seen as a male version of Kaya Lotus. But for them to be conversing that lightly, it could only be unexpected. And that was the same for Chloe and Marco. Chloe placed her chin on Jo Minjun's shoulder and smiled. Her black hair with a trace of orange tickled his neck like a foxtail. Chloe opened her mouth. What's this? When did you get so close? Don't get that disgusting misunderstanding. Because we are not close. Anderson grumbled like that and sat on a sofa that was in a corner. Jo Minjun tapped the chin of Chloe that was placed in his shoulder. Chloe lifted her chin and said, "Did you do well in the interview? Is there something to do good? You just have to answer what you are questioned. It's because you couldn't do that, that a scandal was made." Jo Minjun inflated his cheeks without saying anything, and gulped down the air. There was particularly nothing he could reply. Chloe was right. He did think that he had spoken well, but he was the kind of person that couldn't differentiate between what was right to say and what wasn't. Is it because of the habit when I used to teach my students? He felt sour. Jo Minjun sat on the sofa and looked at Chloe. Then asked. And Kaya? I thought, why weren't you asking? She went out before. She felt uncomfortable. I think that she was going to get some fresh air. Really? Is there a problem? No. It's not a problem. Just so. Jo Minjun spoke. Marco, that was seated next to him, opened his mouth. Is there a need to be worried about her? She's a strong girl. Yes. She is indeed a strong girl. But she is a child. Jo Minjun talked like that and let out a sigh. Even so, he was still a teacher. Just like he acted with Jessie, he couldn't help but feel sad while looking at Kaya. Because it wasn't that he wanted to teach just because of the job. He was normally that kind of person. To butt in. It could be expressed like that, but he was someone that didn't like to see immature children suffering. But just because of that, it would be a funny thing if he went and consoled or advised her. In Jessie's case, the situation turned out like that so he could say something, but Kaya's situation was different. The environment, and her character. Jo Minjun opened his mouth. How much time is left until the mission starts? There would be at least 3 people left to interview. So I think that 15 minutes. You are going to look for her. At Marco's question, Jo Minjun shook his head. It wasn't something he should butt in. There was silence between them for a minute. The one who broke that silence was Chloe and her question. What do you think the next mission will be? This mission's theme will be vegetarian. Emily announced the theme with a lively voice. Jo Minjun just looked at her. Emily smiled brightly and made eye contact with each of the participants. And then continued speaking. When you are operating a restaurant, vegetarians always become a homework for us. And between vegetarians, there are various kinds. Of course, they don't eat meat and fish, and even eggs and milk, and only eat vegetables. Those are vegans. Vegans that are only allowed to eat dairy lactose. They are uncountable. What you people have to do, is to consider us, the judges, as lactose eaters. Saying it with simple words, you can't use any kinds of meat excluding eggs and dairy products. You are also prohibited from using fish and poultry. Those were some picky conditions. But because he could use eggs and dairy products, it would be a bit easier, but being prohibited from using meat varieties was a huge condition. It would be an especially hard mission for the Westerners that mainly ate meat. But it wasn't for Jo Minjun. Because he was Korean. And Korea was one of the countries that was represented for its vegans. There were many vegetarian-related recipes in his head. But the problem was in another thing. 7 points. Should I mind it? The idea he had about cooking score had changed for a long time. Of course, if the cooking score was high, then his dish would also be good. But he got to know that because of a low score, the quality wouldn't drop. Of course, the judges normally preferred high-score dishes, so the higher the score, all the more better. But the problem was that there were two recipes he had thought. One was 7 points, and the other 6. His head was telling him to choose the 7 points dish, but his heart chose the 6 points one. The recipe of the 7 points one was quite simple. You steamed white broccoli, cauliflower. Mixed paprika and butter, applied it on the cauliflower and roasted it. And sprinkling bread powder, herbs, and etc. was the end of it. At first glance, it was quite a simple recipe, but the roasting process needed dedication and skill. And the recipe of the 6 points was one which he was quite accustomed to. It was a recipe copied from a dish that was normally eaten in Korean temples. It was a cabbage roll that contained sliced eggs, tofu, mushrooms, and herbs. On top of that, he wanted to put a raw egg in the bibimbap, and wanted to present gamjajan with chives, and perilla seeds mayakuk, in the same table. It wasn't because he wanted to present a Korean cuisine. Although the score was 6, it was because it was an unusual dish in Korea. But for the judges, it would be a new thing. It was that kind of calculation. Even before he could organize his thoughts in his head, Alan opened his mouth. This mission will be an individual one. You have to take full responsibility of your dish and make it. Nobody replied back. Because they were already busy thinking of the recipe they were going to use. Joseph said with a calm voice. We will give you 5 minutes to think up your recipe. Think of a vegan recipe in that time. Also, the cooking time will be 60 minutes. Jo Minjun fell in his thoughts. If he took into account the flavor and the nutrients, he thought that it would be better to present various dishes in one table. If there was something bothering him, then it would be the estimated 6 points. But he couldn't depend on the system all the time. Jo Minjun wasn't a gamer that played cooking games, but rather, a chef. And his chef subconsciousness was telling him to choose the 6 points recipe. Jo Minjun checked at his surroundings. There were a total of 21 people including him. And they were all participating seriously and passionately in this program. It was rather hurting to his pride. Even if it was a strength he had obtained, he didn't like himself for being looking at the numbers next to those kinds of people. Okay. Let's do it my way this time. I'm also a chef. The system wasn't a loyal object. It was a tool, and he had to utilize it. The moment he was influenced by the score, then at that moment it wouldn't be Jo Minjun cooking, but the system doing it for him. It was at that moment. The buzzer rang. It was the buzzer that signaled the start of the cooking. Joseph opened his mouth and yelled. 60 minutes. Start now. Jo Min-jun didn't waste a minute and went to the pantry. The ingredients he had to pick were simple. Seaweed, perilla seeds, rice, eggs, various vegetables and fruits. The first thing he had to do was the rice. Jo Min-jun washed the rice and threw the water, and then filled the pot again with water and kept it away. They didn't have an electric cooker, so he had to use a pressure cooker instead. In the first place, the electric cooker was only used in Korea or in Japan. It was a fairly unfamiliar tool overseas. Even if it was Grand Chef and they had many ingredients and tools, it was an exception for the electric cooker. After putting the rice to cook, next was the perilla seed myeokguk. The first thing he handled was obviously the seaweed. Jo Min-jun washed it cleanly with cold water, and then, squeezed it out. After that, was the perilla seeds. Jo Min-jun grated the perilla seeds in the rice water. The next step was simple. Jo Min-jun fried the seaweed in the perilla oil, and after putting perilla seed powder, rice water and diced garlic in a pot, he closed the lid. The reason he didn't use instant rice and prepared the rice this way was because of this reason. Because he couldn't use anchovy broth in a vegan dish. The rice water was insufficient, but it would play the role of broth. Seasoning it after it was almost done was enough. Jo Min-jun closed the lid and prepared for the next thing. Gamjaejeon, cabbage roll. The first thing he had to handle was the cabbage roll. It was better to make the gamjaejeon last because of its crunchiness. First, Jo Min-jun simmered the cabbage in a water that was mixed with vinegar and salt. After that, he sliced the vegetables long, and after taking out the water of the tofu, he squashed it. There couldn't be water left on the tofu. Because when you ate it, the water left in it could soak the ingredients in your stomach. It was at that moment. Joseph approached Jo Min-jun and just observed him working. Jo Min-jun too, didn't mind Joseph and ripped the cabbage. Eventually, it was Emily that was looking them who asked as if she was bothered. Joseph. Why are you just looking like that? Because I'm curious. I think that Jo Min-jun isn't trying to make one dish, but an Asian table meal. Will you have enough time? Emily asked, but Jo Min-jun didn't reply. Emily laughed awkwardly. Jo Min-jun was completely focused on the countertop. In the first place, he couldn't even listen any voices. Rather than saying that he was anxious, he was committed. The difficulty of making a table meal was that you had to cook various dishes at the same time. Even if you were concentrated in one thing, you had to check the state of the other dishes. It wasn't in vain that housewives yelled, "Ah," in the middle of cooking, to turn their attention to the cooking that was burning in the frying pan. Of course, the cause of it in Korea would be more because they were focused in watching TV rather than being bad chefs. It had already passed 30 minutes. Jo Min-jun took out the cabbage from the steamer and put tofu, mushrooms, sliced eggs, etc. inside of it. And after putting coriander, basil and other things in it, the flavor was clearly more delicious. But it wasn't a completely good flavor. Because the only seasoning put was the salt, and there was no meat. But it was certainly a food that made you feel good. The cabbage juice flowed in his mouth like juice, and the aroma of the herbs and coriander roamed in his mouth like the mojito's lime aroma. The cooking score was 6. But it was an obvious thing. Because in this kind of cooking, there were no particularly special cooking methods. He thought about roasting the cabbage roll in perilla seed oil and soy sauce, but if he did that, the light flavor would disappear in an instant. Jo Min-jun just sliced the roll and served it in a plate. When he checked the myeokguk, the flavor of the seaweed and garlic was felt really deeply. The feeling of the perilla seeds that roamed at the tip of his tongue was good, and the flavor was also good. Jo Min-jun seasoned it with soy sauce and salt. And closed the lid once again. He had to boil the myeokguk like this until he presented it to the judges. Because the softer the seaweed, then the better. He also checked the rice and it was already cooked. It was a perfectly cooked rice. The species of the rice was kalrose. So compared to the white rice that was eaten in Korea, the flavor was a bit lacking, but that could be fixed with sesame oil. Jo Min-ju sliced the herbs, lettuce, pumpkin, carrots, etc. In the United States, no, in America, they didn't eat plants as herbs, like in Korea. In Korea, it was mostly eaten as herbs. Because of that, Jo Min-jun thought that the bibimbap he was making right now with the vegetables he was using would be felt more freshly. A dish made by a chef, too, and translator. Subak proofreader. Mailed. Chapter 35. A dish made by a chef, 3, you are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 35. A dish made by a chef, 3, first, Jo Min-jun poured some sesame oil in the rice, and mixed the gochujang, and doenjang on a 1:1 ratio and mixed it with the rice. Normally, what differentiated Korean bibimbap was this process. To already have mixed the sauce with the rice, or to present it separately. At times, the sauce was used as garnish. There was a reason Jo Min-jun mixed the sauce beforehand. The first was because this was a mission. To let the judges to do the seasoning as they pleased, he didn't know what kinds of words they would tell them. And basically, Jo Min-jun didn't really like to present gochujang or sesame oil separately in a Korean dish. Because he thought that a chef from a restaurant was the one who had to complete the dish with his own hands. If it was completed by the hands of the customer, then it was pointless. That was Jo Min-jun's way of thinking. Secondly, it was because of the cleanliness. There were many cases where the vegetables or the meat that were used as garnish would rip and crumple when you mixed the sauce. That sight was one that made you not want to eat it. After placing the steaming bibimbap in a small plate, Jo Min-jun placed the entire plate in a bigger and flatter one. Near the round plate bibimbap, were various garnishes placed as flower petals. And placing the yolk on top of the rice, was the end. Jo Min-jun looked at the bibimbap. Bibimbap, freshness. 94% origins. Too many ingredients to show, quality. High, average ingredients, cooking score. 6 points. It was as expected. Jo Min-jun didn't get shaken and looked at the time. 17 minutes. It was enough to make the gamjaejeon. Jo Min-jun grabbed some potatoes and started to grate them. He put the potatoes in a sieve to take off the moisture and sliced some chives and red chili. The reason he couldn't call this a temple dish. God's 5 vegetables. Chives, Korean wild chives, green onions, garlic and hungo. These 5 vegetables were prohibited from being eaten in temples. And he had already used 2 of them. Garlic was used in the mayakuk, and the chives was used in the gamjaejeon. But of course, the theme wasn't even temple cooking, so there was no need to pay it any heed. What was important right now was the flavor and the nutrients. Jo Min-jun put flour on the grated potatoes, and mixed after putting in the chives and the red chili. And then, brought it to the hot frying pan. He had to use a small amount of cooking oil. If he put too much, not only the edges, but also the center would be burnt like a cookie and losing all of its stickiness. But because of that, he couldn't put in too little. Because the gamjaejeon could stick to the pan and the shape would break. Fortunately, Jo Min-jun cooked it better than ever. Chives gamjaejeon, freshness. 92% origins. Too many ingredients to show, quality. High, average ingredients, cooking score. 6 points. Jo Min-jun's eyes twitched. He didn't even have 2 minutes left. He served the mayakuk in a bowl. Westerners weren't really familiar with ingredients like seaweed, but they wouldn't be able to not eat it being a judge in a cooking program and such. Also, he added perilla seeds powder at the last minute just in case. Of course, perilla was also an ingredient Westerners weren't familiar with, but it could save the flavor of mayakuk a little. Jo Min-jun placed the plates on the tray. perilla mayakuk, chives gamjajan, cabbage roll, and bibimbap. An unexpected thing happened at that time. The state windows that were over the plates flinched, and a bigger and clear window appeared over it. Jo Min-jun looked at that situation dumbfoundedly. Soon, another window popped up in front of his eyes. You made a harmonious Korean table meal. Its composition belongs to a certain theme. A new function that lets you evaluate multiple dishes at a time composition score has been added. The skill, comprehension towards Korean cuisine mastery has increased. Will you check the score of the composition? Yes/no. Jo Min-jun still looked at it perplexed. It was at that moment. A new window appeared before him. Jo Min-jun's vegan Korean meal. List. Bibimbap, perilla mayakuk, cabbage roll, chives gamjajan. Average cooking score. 6 out of 10 composition score. 7 out of 10 evaluation. It's a meal made for the vegans. It's characterized for its graceful plating and clean flavor. So it's a good meal to have without any burdens. Jo Min-jun's eyes twitched. A new function appeared. Even before any emotions could surge up, the buzzer rang along Alan's voice. Everybody hands off. The time is over. Alan looked at everybody expressionlessly. Jo Min-jun gulped. The dice has been rolled. Could this meal that was made by his own colors move the judges' hearts? Jo Min-jun checked his surroundings. He saw various and different dishes. Ratatouille, lasagna, Cuba sandwich, etc. Thump. He felt it clearly that his heart was beating. Jo Min-jun licked his lips. Even if he didn't do that, he couldn't do anything about his nervousness. The reason he could stay calm and composed when he was being evaluated was because of the faith he had in the cooking score. However, he got to know that the cooking score wasn't an absolute thing. And right now, the score of these dishes was only 6 points. What he could trust in right now was only in himself. Perhaps, this could be the first time that he had been evaluated properly. Jo Min-jun looked nervously at Alan. When he thought that he had made eye contact with him, Alan opened his mouth and said, "We will start the evaluation. Starting from the front lines." Jo Min-jun was at the second line. The two that were in front of him walked towards the judges with their dishes on their hands. One of those two was Chloe. Jo Min-jun was closely looking at Chloe's dish. Cooking score of 8. It was the best Chloe could get. Chloe's dish was fried wheat noodles that was accompanied with bok choy and bamboo shoots mixed. The light brown sauce seemed to be made with soy sauce and citron and was beneath the noodles, and she placed a half-fried egg in the middle of it as decoration. Because of these many reasons, it could only seem delicious. It seemed a rather easy dish to make, but it was quite difficult. Frying the egg and not cooking the yolk entirely was also skill, and only the fact that it was a fried wheat noodle dish made it difficult to make. She had to fry the noodle sufficiently for it to not get burnt, and at the same time, it had to be sticky. If she made a slight mistake, then that dish wouldn't even be considered as food, but as trash. Alan lifted his fork and split the egg. The thin fried coat separated with the egg white, and on top of that, the watery yolk flowed like orange syrup. It even made the participants that were looking, gulp. Even Chloe was like that. It was a long time that she had felt something she had made to be this delicious. Alan soaked the noodles and the bok choy in the yolk and put it in his mouth. The first thing that spread in his mouth was the citron and soy sauce flavor. The citron's strong flavor made so as the soy sauce's salty flavor was spread faster. When he chewed the bok choy, the citron's aroma was half gone. And what replaced it was the fresh flavor of the bok choy. The noodles that were between the leaves of the bok choy were transmitting the oily flavor along with the yolk. Beautiful. No, it wasn't a flavor that could be described with that soft word. It was full of charisma. It was a primitive and provocative flavor that great generals before a war would eat. Alan desperately tried to stay calm. And it was the same for the two judges besides him. Alan opened his mouth first. Chloe. I ate well. Chloe didn't reply and just laughed awkwardly. It could be seen that she was nervous. Alan asked calmly. Is this your first time making this dish? No. It's a dish that my mom used to make me all the time. Although the half-done fried yolk was implemented by me. My mom just put in half-done yolk. Your mother is surely someone who has a deep understanding in cooking. Of course. Until now, I have never eaten a dish more deliciously than my mother's. So, do you think that you have made the recipe of your mother well? At those words, Chloe hesitated. She talked unconfidently. I already told you that this recipe is my mother's. And you said that my mother had a deep understanding in cooking after trying it. Then that means that you think that my dish was good. No, at least, it is so for my recipe. And to view well a recipe, then you have to do the same for the dish. Stop. At the words that were getting longer, Alan opened her mouth. Chloe, that was talking by herself, stopped and looked at Alan. She just hit the floor with her forefoot. Alan continued speaking. I will go straight to the point. It was a good dish, Chloe. And a delicious one. It's a good dish that made use of the advantage of the fried wheat noodle. Especially, the combination of citron and soy sauce was really good. My opinion is the same. I didn't think that I would feel this good by a dish I have tried for the first time. I ate well. It was a good dish. Emily continued to say after Alan. Chloe smiled brightly at Joseph. Favorable criticism from two people, more than half of them had said that it was delicious, so she was already safe from getting disqualified. Joseph smiled benevolently and said. I ate well, Chloe. You pass. Thank you. Chloe yelled with a voice full of happiness and went upstairs. But the good atmosphere was broken almost instantly. The participant that was next to Chloe presented a baguette sandwich that contained cucumber, tomato, cheddar and fried potato. It was eatable, but it wasn't anything special. From the judges' expression could be clearly seen what they were thinking. The judges ate a bite of the sandwich and chewed. In meantime, it was as if it was really hard to chew, but Alan spat what he had in his mouth to the bin. And after that, there were many things he said. It is too ordinary. I'm getting suspicions on how you survived until now. Did you think that this dish would get a good score? They said many things, but the conclusion was the same. Jamie. You are one of the disqualifying candidates. Go back to your place. And next, was Jo Minjun's turn. Alan raised his voice. Jo Minjun. Helena. Bring your dishes. Jo Minjun walked towards them with the tray in his hands. The first one to be evaluated was Jo Minjun. The judges approached him. Alan looked down at the mayakuk. Is this mayakuk? Yes. I put perilla seeds in it and boiled it. I did eat mayakuk before, but it's a first with perilla seeds in it. How do I have to eat it? You can do it however you want. This is all eaten in Korea, right? Yes. I improved a bit the temple cuisine. The judges first drank the mayakuk. Next it was the bibimbap, and after they ate the rolls they did it too with the gamjajan. Emily let out a sigh. This is difficult. I sympathize with you. Alan nodded and looked at Jo Minjun. It was hard for Jo Minjun to understand what was difficult. Difficult to accept the flavor. Or to evaluate. It was at that time. Joseph hesitated to speak and finally said. Minjun. We will be having a discussion. Step back, please. Jo Minjun didn't say a word and stepped back 5 steps. Emily whispered in a low voice. What are you going to do? It was tasty. It was also tasty for me. For normal people, rather than being exotic, it would not be tasty, but it was good for me. It's a well-done cooking. I couldn't come in contact with a temple cuisine, but the colors of Korean cuisine were alive. But, Alan speaked. Emily understood why Alan was hesitating. Joseph said in a regretful voice. There's no main. Yes. That's right. It was as they had said. What the judges were regretting wasn't about the score Jo Min-jun was worried about, nor the unfamiliar flavor. It was the lack of the main dish. Just that. They could have said that the bibimbap was the main dish. But the strength of the flavor was really weak to be the main of this meal. Alan opened his mouth. If it was a family meal, then it would be a perfect one with nothing else to add. The side dishes are all delicious, and the harmony between them aren't bad at all. However, Alan stopped talking and let out a sigh. Maybe, if he had presented the bibimbap alone, they could have given a higher score. Because the flavor wasn't bad, and the composition was okay. But although he presented many dishes, he forgot about the completeness of this meal. That was the problem. Between the similar level of the dishes, there was nothing that stimulated and made your mouth happy. The flavor was really simple, and it made you feel that they protected each other's flavor. Of course, that meant that he had a high comprehension in all of the dishes. But it's weak. Alan's gaze grew sharp. And after that, the judges started to share their arguments. And the conclusion has been made. Min-jun. Come here. Joseph opened his mouth. Jo Min-jun put on an uneasy face while Joseph put on a smile. Personally, I think that this is the most delicious dish from all of the ones you had made. But the problem isn't the flavor. It's the heart. Until now, the catfish meatball stew, and bream, were all delicious, but your greed could be seen clearly from them. Of course, that's an obvious thing. If you are a participant you hope to pass, and because of that, you can just cook. Joseph talked until there and stopped. He looked at the judges next to him. I think the same thing as Emily and Alan. The dish you have made this time was really warm. It wasn't greedy, and it showed that you wanted to make a delicious and reassuring meal. Putting it in good words, it felt like a mother preparing it. But in bad words, it wasn't a dish from a restaurant, but a meal from our house. Jo Min-jun didn't say a thing. He was only listening attentively at Joseph. Joseph let out a sigh. He seemed to take this evaluation really hard. That's why I can only say sorry. Because it was a really good dish. However, we aren't customers, but judges, and we can't just look at your heart and judge. Min-jun. Joseph looked at Jo Min-jun. Jo Min-jun slowly closed his eyes. He could already guess what he was going to tell him. And that guess didn't go off. I'm sorry. You are a disqualifying candidate. A dish made by a chef, free, end translator. Subak proofreader. Mailed. Chapter 36. Absolute Sense of Taste, 1, you are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 36. Absolute Sense of Taste, 1, eliminating candidate. He thought that one day, he would have to go through it, but he never thought that the day would come so fast. Jo Min-jun went back to his countertop with his tray on his hand. He could see Marco's worried expression. Marco said something through mouth shapes, but he couldn't know the meaning behind them. Jo Min-jun smiled without a word and looked at his cooking. It is close to a family meal. Jo Min-jun, when he heard those words, realized something. That he ended up overlooking something. There was no dish that was captivating enough in his cooking. He needed to make some special dish or had to make many garnishes to take advantage of that richness. But the dishes that were on the tray were only those 4 dishes. Gamjajan, myeokguk, bibimbap, and cabbage roll. There wasn't a characteristical Korean richness, nor charm in these dishes. When he heard that this was a well-made family meal, he couldn't think of any words to refute. Certainly, you wouldn't know if it was a menu from a town restaurant that costed 1,000 wons, note. Korean currency. 1,000 won equals $1 approx, but this wasn't something to be presented in a good restaurant. He also wanted to win through an exotic flavor, but the result wasn't that good. But why could that be? He wasn't feeling that bad. Was it that he didn't feel anything about him being an eliminated candidate? No, that wasn't it. It was different. He did get angry. And it also bothered him. He felt sorry for cooking something that was only that much. But the words of Joseph kept ringing in his mind. That it was the best cooking he had made so far. It was his first dish. Not made as a participant, but as a chef. And Joseph didn't mind the level of the cooking. With that, he felt that one of his guesses were right. The cooking score was of course an important thing, but it didn't determine everything. Just knowing that, he felt warmer. A bitter smile could be seen on Jo Min-jun's face. It was a smile that was hard to notice unless you looked in detail, but the cameraman that was next to him closed up on his smile. It was a strange feeling. The regret and sorrow for becoming one of the eliminated candidate, and at the same time, happiness for his dishes being recognized. The scale was balancing more toward the happiness, but he could do nothing about the bitterness. The evaluation continued. The people Jo Min-jun looked closely were three. Anderson, Kaya and Marco. And those three passed splendidly. From the three dishes, one particularly touched his heart. Anderson's thinly sliced mozzarella cheese scabbed in eggplants. When the judges took a bite of it and the cheese inside the eggplant stretched, Jo Min-jun gulped, having forgotten his own situation. The evaluation all ended. From the 21 people, 13 people passed and all went upstairs. And the remaining disqualifying people were 8. Maybe he could say that he was fortunate, but there was no one close to Jo Min-jun among them. Jo Min-jun looked at the second floor. And made eye contact with Kaya. It was a sharp and ferocious gaze as usual. Kaya opened her mouth. It seemed that she was going to say something, but ended up saying nothing. Jo Min-jun put on a light smile. Even if she did say something, they were on a distance where nothing could be heard. And knowing Kaya's character, she wouldn't even make a sound. Marco, that was next to Kaya, gripped his fist as if he was making a fighting posture. Jo Min-jun faced that fat fist, and made an OK sign. It was at that moment. From the side of the casting crew, a loud voice was heard. The eliminated candidates will be having an interview before the loser's mission. Come to do the interview in the order you were evaluated. Jo Min-jun was the second. After waiting for a while, Jo Min-jun went in the interviewing room. Martin was smiling as usual. At the same time Jo Min-jun seated in his place, Martin asked. How are you feeling right now? Regretful. Jo Min-jun said briefly. At that moment, Martin thought that it was because he was bothered by that question, but soon changed his mind after seeing Jo Min-jun's expression. To say that he was in a bad situation, he had an excessively calm face. How could he be like that? Martin thought of Jo Min-jun to be a greedy participant. Of course, there would be no greedy participants, but, at least, he wasn't like a Taoist that didn't dwell in front of victory. But in Jo Min-jun's face couldn't even be seen a trace of despair that normal losers should have. So did he have to interpret that as something good? Maybe it could be seen that he didn't hold any grudges. But Jo Min-jun wasn't that kind of participant. The cameraman normally follows him around only on broadcasting days, but the camera installed in the kitchens and other places were always running. And what the camera recorded was that Jo Min-jun was one of the participants that practiced the most in the kitchen. Because of that, he couldn't say that Jo Min-jun didn't hold any grudge. Martin asked in a rather calm voice. Contrary to saying that it was regretful, you seem quite calm. Really? Yes. Did you maybe get through it? I wonder. It's difficult to say that. But I'm not feeling that good. The words Joseph told me, that it was a good meal stays in my heart. Jo Min-jun replied like that and smiled faintly. It was a smile that wasn't made up. An honest one. Martin thought that it would be good material and asked. If you get to disqualify in this mission, then will you be able to smile like you are right now? Jo Min-jun didn't reply for a long while. When Martin started to feel frustrated, Jo Min-jun replied in a low voice. What did I tell you the first time we saw? That I wanted to confirm whether I should be cooking or not. Yes. And that the winner was going to be Kaya, if there were no upsets. And if there was, that upset was going to be you. You also said that. At those words Martin said jokingly, the smile in Jo Min-jun disappeared instantly. Jo Min-jun opened his mouth. A loud and hard voice was heard. The words I said at that time, I will have to cancel them. Yes. I understood this time. That I don't like losing nor getting eliminated. The participants, they cook and I also do. Their dishes are delicious and so are mine. I won't keep saying that it is something unavoidable. I will reach the highest I can. I won't stop for myself. His determination was transmitted in those words. It seemed like he was chewing each of the words and spitting them out. Maybe, if this was a movie, Martin's role would just be to admire him at those words. But this was an audition program. It was an interview. Martin couldn't help but throw another question at him. But what are you going to do if a huge wall stands in front of you? What if you end up falling? Jo Min-jun replied without hesitating. I'm going to cry. I'm going to shout and yell. But. In the end, Jo Min-jun rested for a moment. And Martin gulped. The cameraman that was next to them, and the broadcast writer were looking at Jo Min-jun's mouth nervously. I will have to stand up. Because that's what I have to do. Everyone's interview ended, and the 8 participants stood in front of their countertops. The judges looked at the disqualifying candidates warmly. Alan stood in front. He had his fingers intertwined and said severely. You people are about to get eliminated right now. There will be 3 people eliminated among you, and perhaps, even more so. A heavy atmosphere presented for a moment. Nobody could open their mouths. Even the participants that passed and were on the second floor, and the disqualifying candidates. They couldn't help but get closer in the time they were together. They knew that they were competitors, but they got along all the days. On top of that, they had the same hobby of cooking, so it was hard not to get closer between them. To open your mouth in front of those participants and the heavy atmosphere, it would be a difficult thing to do so even if you were a judge. Alan opened his mouth. When he did so, his eyes were sunk really deep. I will announce the elimination mission. It wasn't a loud voice. But it couldn't be helped but to be heard more clearly than ever. Jo Min-jun just looked at Alan. Alan brought a big wooden box to the table where the judges were. When he opened the box, a groaning sound could be heard from the participants. Because they could deduce what the theme would be just by looking at that. Alan said. It will be a tasting mission. The fried tofu pockets that are in front of you each contain different things. The ingredients that are contained in a pocket are 20. You will have to say what those 20 ingredients are and guess the contents. The 3 that guessed the least amount of ingredients will be the ones to get eliminated, and if there is someone who didn't even get one right, will also get eliminated if there are already 3 eliminated people. Jo Min-jun just looked at the wooden box. There were 10 pockets inside of it. And they were all numbered. At the same time, Jo Min-jun could confirm that he would be winning this mission. He couldn't help but think like that. Because he had the strength of the system. He was confident on being able to guess the ingredients better than anyone in the world. If they didn't have an absolute taste like Kaya, it was impossible to name all of the ingredients as precisely as Jo Min-jun. The cooking score of the fried tofu pockets varied. They were mostly 5 points, but there were also 4 points. It seemed like they focused on the ingredients inside of it rather than the flavor. Alan elevated his tone of voice. Pick your fried tofu pockets. The turns will be decided with the order of the numbers. At those words, the participants approached the pockets and picked a number. The first thing that disappeared was the number 1 pocket. It was understandable. Because in these kind of missions, it would be more comfortable to go first. Because in the end, they just had to wait for 3 more people that got a lower score than them. It was better to know their own score early on. But of course, if a situation occurred where they got 2 ingredients right, it would be a completely meaningless election. Because Jo Min-jun didn't hurry, the remaining numbers were only 8, 9 and 10. Jo Min-jun picked the number 10 calmly. Alan glanced at Jo Min-jun and then opened his mouth. It would be better to go first. Why didn't you hurry? Because it's meaningless. He didn't know how he would interpret that, but Alan stared at Jo Min-jun for a while. But fortunately, he didn't extend the conversation. As Jo Min-jun got back to his place, Alan looked at the participant with the number 1 pocket and said, Selena, come out and try your fried tofu. Selena. The one who claimed to be a housewife was wearing her apron and walked forward with a faint smile. After she ate it, she started to name the ingredients in a rather bright voice. But when she got the first one wrong, the second, and also the third one, her voice became clearly more unconfident. In the end, the ingredients she guessed right were 5. 5 out of 20. And the next participant didn't do much better. 6. The one who did the worst was the 6th participant. A white man that was over his 60s, Dan, could only get 3 ingredients right. It was understandable. Because the older you got, your sense of taste got duller. Even if he tried to do his utmost to sense the ingredients, there was a limit to it. The 7th participant was a food stylist, Danny. He got 11 ingredients right away and got the admiration from the people upstairs. But after that, he got it all wrong. But of course, it was a really good score getting 11 right. And then, Jo Min-jun's turn came. Come to the front, Min-jun. Jo Min-jun walked with a calm face. And didn't hesitate for even a minute and put the fried tofu pocket in his mouth. It happened so fast, that Alan got perplexed. Jo Min-jun chewed a few times and gulped it down. And then closed his eyes. A window appeared in that darkness. Fried tofu pocket, freshness. 84% origins. Too many ingredients to show, quality. High, average ingredients, cooking score. 4 out of 10. The flavor was only eatable. But the most important right now wasn't that. Jo Min-jun removed the setting of the hidden ingredients. And at that moment, all of the ingredients that contained showed up. Jo Min-jun said in a calm voice. Beet. Yes. Coriander. Yes. Bamboo shots, yes. Jo Min-jun kept naming all of the ingredients without stopping. Duck eggs, pistachio, chaga mushrooms, squash. And he also guessed the unexpected ingredients like front pork leg, octopus body, herring body fat. And the only thing Alan could reply was, there is. When Jo Min-jun got 17 ingredients right, the people in the second floor were filled with amazement. It was a shocking thing. And Alan was no exception. He was forcing to look calm, but his eyes were twitching a little. Even he was only confident in guessing 12 right, if he was asked to do so. But right now, in front of him was a young Asian man getting all of the ingredients right. What is this cursing sense of taste? No, it wasn't just the problem of tasting. He had to eat and feel what the ingredients were in order to differentiate them with all of the food in the word. If he didn't incorporate it in his tongue, it was an impossible thing to do. He wondered if it was a humane ability to be able to guess the parts of the pork or octopus that only a bean size of it was used. Jo Min-jun opened his mouth once again. It seemed like it was bothersome to name each of the ingredients, so he named the remaining 3 ingredients at once. Ground cherry pepper, dang noodles, tofu. Jo Minjun said that and slowly opened his eyes. He said in a rather cool voice. That's the end, and then Alan replied. I will get crazy. Absolute sense of taste, 1, end translator. Subak proofreader. Mailed. Chapter 37. Absolute sense of taste, 2, you are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 37. Absolute sense of taste, 2, nobody said a word. They just couldn't. Even accepting what just happened was hard to do so. No, precisely speaking, it was excluding 2 people. One of them was Kaya. She was standing with her arms crossed and observing down at Jo Minjun. And the other one was an unexpected person, Martin. He could only do so. No one was expecting that kind of ability from Jo Minjun, and it was the same for Martin. No, was that something that could be explained through tasting? He had just seen what had happened with his own eyes, but even still, it was unbelievable. This is great. Great. This scene was the greatest in this season. No, it was also the greatest from all of the previous ones. Because there was no such thing that made you happy and flustered than his ability. Even right now, his heart was thumping so madly that it could almost be heard. It was to the point that he couldn't wait to see the reactions of the participants. Maybe, some would say that it was made up. The argument would bore an issue, and the issue would come back like a huge snowball in the form of elevated ratings. In Martin's face could be seen a smile so big that almost seemed to rip. He had never thought that Jo Minjun would be a treasure trove. His handsome face and right attitude was just to attract fans, but in the end, this was a cooking program. When his dishes were compared to the other chefs, it couldn't be seen as anything special. Coupling with Kaya, and looks that caught the viewers' hearts. That was what Martin had thought of him until now. I was leaving a jewel in the ground, Martin sighed while mumbling. He couldn't hold the regret to have known of his ability just now. It was at that moment. The youngest PD that was next to him whispered in his ear. Sun Bei. Weren't the contents leaked? Don't speak nonsense. The ones who filled the contents of the pocket were the judges themselves. If Minjun wanted to know the answer, then he would have to buy the judges. Do you think that the judges would sell themselves to this youth? But even so. He got all of that. Is that possible? Reality is always more fictitious than fiction itself. Keep looking. Because this is an important scene that doesn't show up much. Minjun. Did you have an absolute taste? It's similar. Jo Minjun replied like that. Because it wasn't like he did have it. But because of that, he couldn't reveal the system. Saying the truth, if he had wanted to avoid this kind of situation, he could. Because he could get some ingredients wrong on purpose. But he didn't want to. He did think of the system as foul play. But he would stop doing so. The danger of getting disqualified stimulated him. Because this was a place where if you lacked something for even a moment, you would fall. It was that kind of war. And Jo Minjun even had to show an ability he didn't really have. He wasn't in a situation where he could relax. The reason why he got all 20 ingredients right, was partly because he wanted to promise himself. He wanted to show all of his abilities. He wanted to show everything he had to the judges, and to the people. Jo Minjun opened his mouth. Can I go now? Jo Minjun pointed to the place where the eliminated candidates were. Precisely speaking to the place where the confirmed surviving candidates were gathered. Alan flinched and looked back at Joseph. It was the same for Joseph to be surprised at Jo Minjun's sense of taste. Joseph said. I will now announce the disqualified people. Selena, Dan, Jordan. It's unfortunate, but your relation with Grand Chef will be up to here. Selena started to cry. The judges and the people who passed looked at her with a sad expression. 3 people got out from the broadcasting place and soon, it was filled with silence. At that moment, Jo Min-jun couldn't know if they were silent because of him, or because of the 3 people that left. Jo Min-jun looked up. All of their gazes were directed to Jo Min-jun. Rather than saying that it was burdensome, it was strange. Did he ever get this much attention? Oh, right. There was one time when he claimed that the winner was going to be Kaya. But the sights from them and now were completely different. Envy. Jealousy. Those were sights that couldn't be expressed with any words. Those were sights he had never experienced before. Jo Min-jun lowered his head. After all of those gazes, the one who opened his mouth was Joseph. Joseph said hurriedly. You possess an ability we couldn't even think of. I'm impressed. Thank you. Jo Min-jun replied with a cool expression. However, Joseph couldn't be as cool as him. Because the more sensitive a chef was to flavor, the better dish he would be able to make. Having a deep understanding to flavor means that he would be able to make that much of a delicious dish. Joseph opened his mouth for a while. But the words that were supposed to come out remained in his mouth. Those were some heavy words to casually say them. He couldn't be caught in the moment and just say some random things. In the end, Joseph could only calm down his excitement. Joseph started to calm down and opened his mouth. I asked to the participants upstairs to come down. The participants that were on the second floor conversed between themselves and came down to the second floor. The moment Jo Min-jun turned his head, he could see that Kaya was looking at him. It was at that moment when Kaya was opening her mouth. In front of him, Chloe's face appeared out of nowhere. Congratulations. I didn't know I would be able to see someone that guesses the ingredients in such a cool way. Before, he thought that she was staring dumbfoundedly, but it seems that she has memorized everything in her head. Chloe smiled and said. Do you have an absolute sense of taste? I'm quite curious. Ahem. Alan's coughing could be heard. Only then did Chloe realize that the judging hadn't ended. Chloe's face reddened and shut her mouth. Jo Min-jun slightly glanced at Kaya. Suddenly, her sight was directed at the judges. Congratulations. You 18 people are the ones who get to participate in the next mission. At that moment, everyone cheered rejoicingly. Just then, 3 people that used to be with them disqualified, but a happy thing was a happy thing. Of course, those who were close to those 3 just clapped. Emily smiled and said. Until the next mission, you are free. I hope that you get a comfortable time. But you mustn't relax. Don't forget that you are gathered in a place where many amateur chefs came to realize their dreams. This is a place that demands your pride and responsibility. Alan said with his usual cold voice. But he, who was looking at all the participants, fell his gaze on Jo Min-jun and laughed. But it seems that you will have to talk about many things today. Now, go. Go and rip your prey to your heart's contents. Alan talked like that and turned back. It was at that moment, almost all of the participants turned their heads to look at Jo Min-jun. After Alan's not-so-considerate consideration, Jo Min-jun went to the interviewing room. He had already come before the disqualifying mission, but the atmosphere was different. Jo Min-jun looked at Martin's sparkling eyes and could know, for the first time in his life, what a real sparkling eye was. And he thought that it was quite a burdensome and harsh expression. Jo Min-jun said with his voice trembling. Martin, until when are you planning to look at me like that? Don't you know that feeling? When you pick a rock without thinking of anything and that rock turns out to be a valuable jewel worth tens of thousands of dollars. That's what I'm feeling right now. Is that supposed to make me happy? In the end, it means that you used to look at me like an ordinary rock. But it also means that now I look at you like a jewel. Martin talked like that and smiled, letting all of his teeth be shown. Jo Min-jun could confirm. That from all of those times he saw Martin, he was the happiest right now. But he could understand him. Because for a PD, there was nothing more precious than an excellent scene. And the scene from Jo Min-jun in the eliminating mission was such a scene. So, the interview. First, let's go with the basic things. How are you feeling right now? Saying the truth, I don't feel bad. Because I survived. It's not a situation where I should be sad. What did you think when you got to know that it was going to be a tasting mission? I survived. Jo Min-jun didn't hesitate and replied. Martin nodded as if he understood him. It means that you were confident in tasting, it's similar. Jo Min-jun replied bluntly. He felt like he was being praised for cheating on an exam and getting a full score. But he started to get more shameless. Because even if he answered through his tasting or through the system, the result was that it was still his ability. Why didn't you tell us until now? If we knew that you had an absolute taste, because it's another thing than cooking. There was no need to say it. Of course, there was also no need to hide it, so I showed it like this. Does the score you told us about last time related to your tasting? At that question Jo Min-jun flinched. He didn't know what he should reply. But because it was the same function of the system, it was better to just say that it was because of his tasting. Jo Min-jun nodded and said. Yes. Then the top score would obviously be 10, right? That's right. However, I never ate a 10 points dish. Because it's not just the flavor, it's also the skill and experience of the chef that I evaluate. If it was the same as before, he would just say that he was bluffing, but looking at his absolute taste, such thoughts didn't even show up. Martin put on a smile and looked at Jo Min-jun. At that smile that seemed to appreciate him with whatever he did, Jo Min-jun backed off a little. Saying that you haven't experienced a 10 points dish means that you did for a 9 points. Yes. Only once. At East Rabbit Garden. The sheep ribs over there were an absolute art. Just once. I think I get what you're talking about. Then what about the 8 points? Only being an 8 points dish can make your whole day happier. I have eaten such a dish in this competition. Jo Min-jun started to think. Saying the truth, he had seen many 8 points dishes. Kaya's grilled eel was 8 points, and her salmon tataki salad was also 8 points, but because it didn't match the theme, it couldn't be eaten by the judges. Chloe's pan-fried scallops were also 8 points. For it to be an amateur competition, there were a lot of 8 points dishes. It was also that this season's level was high. But the 8 points dishes he could name right now, were the ones he had tried. Because he couldn't judge a dish he didn't even eat. And there was only one dish. Chloe's pan-fried scallops. The foie gras he had made by Kaya was also 8 points, but because he was being evaluated by the judges, he didn't have the time to try it. Jo Min-jun opened his mouth. In my opinion, the pan-fried scallops Chloe made when we teamed up was an 8 points. Beyond that, I wouldn't know because I haven't tried any. So what's the highest you can make with your own hands? Unfortunately, I still can't cook an 8 points dish. Making a 7 points one is my utmost. Maybe, it could be a rather funny scene. Because even when Michelin restaurants were evaluated, there were many restrictions and strictness on the evaluation. And that person was evaluating a dish just by himself. But it's different when he has an absolute taste. Martin thought like that and still didn't erase that big smile that seemed to rip. Compared to what Jo Min-jun had given him, this treatment was nothing. The interview lasted for a long while more. It was a longer interview than usual. And because of that, Jo Min-jun didn't feel like doing anything. Being interviewed was more taxing than cooking. I will slowly get back and rest. That's what he thought, thinking about it. Even when he got back he would be interviewed by the participants. It was when he was leaving the interviewing room without strength. After he opened the door, Jo Min-jun stopped his steps. A long and curly blonde hair was fluttering in front of him. When he was looking at the nape of that woman, she turned back. Jo Minjun opened with his voice trembling. Emily. Absolute sense of taste, 2, N translator. Subak proofreader. Mailed. Chapter 39. The role of a head chef, 1, you are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 39. The role of a head chef, 1, I have been waiting for you. Emily said that and smiled brightly. Jo Minjun looked at her with a puzzled expression. It was the first time he had a conversation in private with Emily, no, with a judge. It couldn't be helped. Because they were busy people. They only appeared when they had to broadcast, and aside for that, they were each doing what they had to do. They were in a really different situation than the participants. Why were you? Well, I don't like to hit around the bush. So I will go straight to the main point. I can, right? Yes. Jo Minjun replied briefly. The smile that was on Emily's face became lighter. She put on a more serious look and opened her mouth. Have you ever thought of becoming an Epicurean? What? At the sudden question, Jo Minjun's brows twitched. Emily raised both of her palms as if she understood him and continued saying. I know. That it's too sudden and that it will puzzle you. But I couldn't be still after what you have showed me. The tasting mission. At Jo Minjun's question, Emily nodded. She said. You're tasting. If you become an Epicurean then you will become one of the best in the world. Cooking. Of course, tasting is important. However, tasting is just one factor required to cook. But when you evaluate a dish, it's the most valuable ability. He could vaguely understand what Emily was trying to say. However, Jo Minjun's was rigid. He replied in a low voice. I'm a chef. I like to cook. I understand. I won't urge you to immediately become an Epicurean. However, you can come to me whenever you want to become one. Because I will raise you, Emily gave him her business card. Jo Minjun stared at the business card for a while, and finally let out a sigh and accepted it. Emily smiled faintly as if she was feeling sorry. Beov, to propose something like this to someone that dreams to become a chef, maybe I only got your head messier. I'm really sorry about that. There will be no way I give up. I also hope so. Because people who enjoy good flavor, can give it. Probably, if you keep walking straight, you will become an excellent chef. That will be a good thing by itself. Emily stopped talking and looked at her watch in her left wrist. And she put a surprised expression and clasped her hands. Wow. It's almost time for the plane. I will have to go. Don't be bothered too much about it. Because I have only teased you once. I'm not. Then, it's a relief. Phew, I will really miss the plane like this. I'll see you at the next mission. Ah. And you were really cool today. Jo Minjun didn't reply and let out a troubled laugh. Emily waved her hands and left. Listening to the steps that her high heels made, another accustomed voice sounded from behind. Emily loves Epicureans. Jo Minjun got surprised and looked back. And then, let out a sigh. For one problem to appear after another. It was a judge after another. Alan was seated in a sofa that was close to the hallway's wall. Alan turned over the page of the magazine he had in his hands and opened his mouth. And you will become quite a good Epicurean. Is it a special day? I think it's the first time meeting the judges aside from the missions. Well, don't you know the reason yourself? Minjun. Alan closed the magazine. Even so, he wanted to tell him something, but it all seemed too made up. Jo Minjun looked at Alan. Alan's dark brown eyes were as difficult to see through as ever. What do you think about Emily's proposal? If you are talking about me becoming an Epicurean, then I think that I won't even have to think twice about it. Jo Min-jun didn't even hesitate and replied. And he thought that Alan was going to like that answer. However, there couldn't be seen any changes in Alan's expression. Alan said in a low voice. It's a good proposal. Yes. Because it was way too unexpected, Jo Min-jun's voice flowed trembling. Alan said calmly. Being a chef is a hard and arduous job. You have to work when others eat, and even if you don't smoke, there are many cases where you end up with lung cancer because of the repeated use of oil. You have to be in front of fire in summer, and in winter, you have to put your hands in ice water. Jo Min-jun didn't say a word and just listened to him. He believed that Alan wasn't really telling him to become an Epicurean. He wanted to believe so. Alan continued talking. An Epicurean is different than being a food critic. It's not suited to you. You have talent in cooking. But it's not as much as tasting food. I think that you will be more successful as an Epicurean than a chef. However. Alan got up from the sofa. He threw the magazine he had in his hands to the bookshelf and opened his mouth. I hope that you won't give up the road to becoming a chef. Even if you are threatened by lung cancer, accidents, heat or cold, I hope you become a chef. The reason why I'm standing here right now is because of that. Because it was obvious that you would get seduced by that woman, Emily. You are worrying for nothing. That proposal wasn't charming at all. I am going to become a chef. No. It is charming. Even if you don't feel it like that right now, the day that you feel it as such will come. It's something that you can't help it if you are human. The people who saw the dishes will imagine through them the good life of the chefs, but what really is in the kitchen is reality and pain. Cooking in your house and in a restaurant is different. Jo Min-jun didn't reply back. He couldn't say that in the past, no, in the future he had worked as the youngest chef in a restaurant. But it was also a funny thing if he said that he understood all of the hardship with just that experience. Alan said in a low voice. The voice seemed to be coming from a teacher teaching his young student. That voice was the same he had when he used to teach, so Jo Min-jun could feel Alan's goodwill. That's why he didn't say a thing. It's not that I'm disregarding your passion for cooking. I'm just saying these things to let you know that it's really difficult. I have something to ask. Yes. Tell me. Why are you treating me this well? For Jo Min-jun, he could only be curious. Just now, he had said with his own mouth that he was more talented in tasting than cooking. Then why? Alan replied. You can't make something you don't know. It's the same for flavor. If you do know the flavor, then you can also bring it out. And I'm curious as to what kind of dish you will make when you grow. Perhaps, Alan seemed to want to say something, but in the end he closed his mouth. Jo Min-jun let out a sigh and said. I understand why you are acting like this. I thank you for your interest and worry. But I want to say that you are worrying in vain. My skills are still lacking and I don't have much experience. However, Jo Min-jun paused for a moment. And then, looked at Alan's dark eyes. A world-class master chef. Even with that overwhelming difference, he didn't back down. I also know the happiness of cooking. The satisfaction when I cook a delicious dish, and looking at the people eating it getting happier. Cooking is the most precious gift life has given me, so how can I let it go? Absolute sense of taste. He was going back to his room and started to think. If you know the flavor then a good dish comes out. Honestly, those words didn't make him much happier. It wasn't that he knew the flavor, but had the system's strength. The absolute taste Alan was thinking about would be more suitable for Kaya than for him. Thinking about that, he started to think that he wanted to get that absolute taste. Would the system provide him that? He couldn't know. In the first place, he didn't even know if the levels went up when his skills improved, or if his skills improved when he leveled up. However, his thoughts didn't last long. When he was getting up to the fourth floor where his room was, the participants that were gathered on the lobby looked at him. Even at first glance, there were at least 10 pair of eyes looking at him. Jo Minjun said nervously. I'm a little busy. How weird. The schedule for the participants is all the same, but for some participants to be busier than others. Kaya, that was seated in the sofa's arm, laughed while mumbling. Her smoky makeup seemed more grumpy today. Chloe tapped an empty space of the sofa and said. Aren't you tired? Come here. I'm not particularly tired. Jo Minjun grumbled and sat on the sofa. A ginger-haired young white man opened his mouth. Was it Jacob? His voice was clear and had a big body. He wasn't really close to Jo Minjun. What was that from before? Do you really have an absolute sense of taste? Well, it couldn't be described with other words. To deny it in this situation was a funny thing to do. Jo Minjun turned his head. Chloe was looking at him with eyes so sparkling that it bothered him. She opened her mouth. I'm really curious about how an absolute taste feels. How is it? Do you feel happier when you eat something delicious? I wonder. I don't even know other people's sense of taste, so wouldn't it be weird for me to say something? You are right. Then what about pickiness? I'm not really more picky. You should know as we have eaten together before. I thought that I knew, but I didn't know that you had such a sensitive tongue. Isn't it really not tasty, but you are just not showing it? How could I? It was a good dish. As Jo Minjun replied like that, Chloe let out air as if she was relieved. It was at that moment that he thought that her face seemed like a squirrel, or like a turtle, but she was really cute. A husky voice was heard as if it was making fun of him. You would be happy. Having an absolute taste and all. Jo Minjun let out a laugh as if he found it ridiculous. If other people asked him that, he would understand them. But the one that said that was none other than Kaya Lotus. She didn't have a fake tongue like him, but a real cursed tongue. Jo Minjun thought that she did have an absolute taste. The reason he thought that was because of her tasting level. Kaya's tasting level was 10. Of course, he didn't know if that meant that she had an absolute taste or not. In the first place, the videos Jo Minjun saw about Kaya didn't mention her having an absolute taste. But he thought that it would be weird if she was level 10 in tasting and didn't have an absolute sense of taste. Well, the important thing right now is not that. Somehow, he had to get out of that swamp surrounded by gazes. However, it didn't seem that easy. How did you guess the part from that small piece? Can you differentiate between beetroot and radish? Can you differentiate the ratio of a dough through flavor? There were many questions being poured at him, so he couldn't answer any of them. It was at that moment when the questions seemed to be ending. Kaya sat on the armchair of the sofa that Jo Minjun was seating, and brought her finger to his mouth. Actually, it was a dumpling she had given to him. Jo Minjun closed his lips and looked at Kaya with big, round eyes. Kaya put on a malicious smile and whispered. I made them. Eat. Why don't you guess what's in it? No, I. Cough. When he was about to say something, Kaya put another dumpling in Jo Minjun's mouth and pushed. Jo Minjun could only chew them. And after chewing for a bit, he covered his nose. A strong smell flowed through his nose and seemed to pierce his brain. Kaya smiled. Do you know what it is? Jo Minjun still covered his nose and didn't reply. He couldn't reply. Jo Minjun looked resentfully at Kaya. And in front of his eyes, a window appeared as always. Wasabi dumplings, freshness. 88% origins. Too many ingredients to know, quality. High, average ingredients, cooking score. 4/10 absolute tasting, 3, end translator. Subak proofreader. Mailed. Chapter 40. The role of a head chef, 2, you are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 40. The role of a head chef, too. There was a little change after word that Jo Min-jun had an absolute taste spread. And that was that the other participants brought the dishes they made to Jo Min-jun. At first, it was quite good because he could eat various dishes, but as time passed by, it became more tiresome. The participants didn't simply want him to taste it. He didn't know where they had heard from, but they also knew that Jo Min-jun could score a dish. And the result was what was happening right now. What is the score? Chloe looked carefully at Jo Min-jun. The noodle was blended along a peanut, pork, green onions, etc. sauce. Dandan noodles. It was a simple dish from China, just like it was for bibimbap in Korea. And because it was simple, and even the cooking method was simple, the score could only be low. 6 points. Jo Min-jun wondered how he had to reply to her and brought the noodles to his mouth. The peanut oil that was fried along with chili was covering the noodles like a sauce, and as soon as he ate a bite, his tongue got slightly numb. But the numbness felt good. After the spicy flavor, came the delicious flavor, and the thick noodles that were between udon, and Chinese noodles, lessened the oily flavor. The salty flavor of the pork was also good. But the end result was 6 points. Jo Min-jun put the friendliest voice he could and opened his mouth. It's delicious. I'm not even Chinese, so it's rather awkward to say this, but I think that you expressed all of the flavor the dandan noodles could have. Really? But the score is only 6. At Jo Min-jun's words, Chloe became instantly depressed. It seemed like she was trying not to get that depressed, but it was also a score that was hard to get happy with. Jo Min-jun tapped her shoulder and said, I told you. That high-scored dishes aren't the only good ones. The score only shows the technique that was used in the dish. Although it could be an important standard on missions, usually, there's no need to be bothered too badly about it. Then that means that if this dish is presented in a mission, it would be difficult to pass, right? Probably, you won't receive favorable comments. Excluding the things he had observed until now, there were cases where 6 points dishes would be approved and passed by the judges. Probably, it would be a dish that contained something other than cooking technique, but not only because it was a 6 points dish meant that you were going to get eliminated. However, this dandan noodles was different. The score was a score, but it didn't seem to have the strength to pass on a mission. He couldn't console her through lies. Jo Min-jun remembered that Chloe didn't survive for long, and he thought that it was because she focused more on flavor than in the cooking process. Perhaps it would be something possible because of her pure love for cooking, but even so, she had to be more greedy to survive in these missions. Didn't he almost get disqualified for his sloppily made Korean meal? Jo Min-jun said in a serious tone. Chloe. I understand the philosophy you have for cooking. You care more about the flavor than the technique, right? I also understand that. However, that shouldn't be the case for the missions. You saw the results I got in the previous vegetarian mission. Of course, aside from the technique, it wasn't such a good dish. To make bibimbap that wasn't even fried rice along with seaweed soup on the mission, it was indeed terrible. Kaya, that was across them, said while laughing. Jo Min-jun glared at her, but she pouted at him as implying what did he want. Marco opened his mouth. Even so. I think that it was a nice try. What? That meal? No. Challenging the mission with a relatively familiar meal. Of course, the results weren't good. But chefs often want to make that warm meal. If you want to make something warm, you can just fry it on the frying pan. Kaya replied like that and grumbled. Jo Min-jun let out a sigh. Whatever, what I want to say is this. That it's good to make a good dish for a mission, but basically, you have to show your skills and experience with your dish. Because in the end, the judges evaluate that. I don't want to look at you disqualifying because you weren't greedy enough. He thought that those weren't some special words, but at that moment, silence flowed in the table. Jo Min-jun looked dumbfoundedly at everyone. Chloe was putting on a deeply moved face, and Kaya was putting on a disgusted face. Although Marco had a normal expression, in the first place, his fat covered his face, so it was difficult to discern his expressions. Jo Min-jun said with his voice trembling. Why with that expression? Putting aside that you are saying that to a competitor. Aren't those some romantic words? This isn't even a love program, but a cooking program. Kaya frowned as if something wasn't to her liking. Jo Min-jun replied hurriedly. Don't turn it to a weird direction. It's nothing like that. Enough. I'm leaving first. I'm getting the creeps. Who's in charge of washing the dishes today? You are. Don't escape and just sit down. At Jo Min-jun's words, Kaya clicked her tongue and sat again on the chair. Jo Min-jun opened his mouth. Last time, when I was conversing with Mr. A, who's Mr. A? You know. Anderson. I was in the middle of conversing with Anderson, you conversed with him. Weren't you in bad terms? No, but even if we were, we aren't permitted from conversing. If I have to explain it, I was hungry that night, and wasn't sleepy, so that night I went to the kitchen. Went. Jo Min-jun stopped talking. His knitted brows were expressing his emotions clearly. Kaya leaned her body towards the chair after laughing as if she understood. After feeling that he had overcome something difficult, Jo Min-jun continued talking. Anyways, I had the chance to converse with Anderson. And at that time, there was something we talked about. That good food is different to well-made food. And that what we have to show to the judges is a well-made dish. But even so, you made that Korean meal. At Kaya's words, he didn't have particularly anything to refute her. When Jo Min-jun closed his mouth, Chloe tapped Jo Min-jun's back and said in a severe tone. Kaya. Stop bullying him. But I didn't. Kaya pouted out her lips and mumbled. Marco that was eating the crepe he made, only opened his mouth then. Min-jun. It's my turn. Marco served the crepe in Jo Min-jun's plate. And said with expectant eyes. Tell me the score of my dish. The days on Grand Chef's house passed by quite quickly. When you spend every day with people that enjoy cooking, those days were felt as camping. And soon, the third episode had also ended. They were all related to the qualifying phase. From the next broadcast, the main phase should start broadcast. The participants waited every day for the episode to be broadcasted. Those were leisure and comfortable times. But Jo Min-jun couldn't spend his time leisurely. And the reason he was making the call right now was because of that. Yes. I think I will go after a while. Traveling fees. I have plenty. Yes. Don't worry. Yes. I will call you next time. The day where the mission was going to be announced, at the kitchen. When the judges were waiting in the broadcasting place, a call from Lee Hyezian came suddenly. It seems that she was worried for her son that was far away from her. The call ended, and Jo Min-jun let out a long sigh. It was about time he told her about Grand Chef, but his mouth didn't easily open. Marco that was next to him, looked with amazed eyes. You talk Korean really well. In the first place, I am Korean. Oh, right. I tend to forget because your English is really natural. Thank you. Jo Min-jun replied while laughing. Chloe, that was next to him, asked as if she was worried. You still didn't tell your parents. It's about time I should. But I think that they will be troubled if I did that. I think that they will be less troubled if I tell them after getting a good result. It's complicated. Fine. What about this? You are going to tell them if you pass this mission. What if I don't? Then, I will tell them that Jo Min-jun loves cooking the most in this world, and he is the sexiest when he does so. That this road is Jo Min-jun's road. That if you allow him to, he will surely become a good chef. How about it? I only heard the part of me being sexy. Ugh, enough. Chloe replied like that, and turned her head. It was at that moment when Jo Min-jun was laughing at her. The door opened and the judges came in. The participants and Jo Min-jun started to applaud. It wasn't because they wanted to, but because it was an indication from the director. After the judges passed by them, they looked at them with an expression you couldn't know as usual. And among the judges, Joseph was holding a big box. Even at first glance, it seemed like a box used to draw lots. Was it related to the announcement of the mission? Everyone were tilting their heads when Emily opened her mouth. It's been a while. Before announcing the mission, I want to congratulate you all. You have done well. You are the most outstanding 18 people from those 1,000 participants from all around the world. At the end of those words, cheers were heard. Of course, half of those were because of the indications they had received, but Jo Min-jun, while cheering, could feel his chest getting hotter. The most outstanding 18. It would be a lie if those words didn't make him happy. Alan took a step and opened his mouth. Saying that you are able to make these kinds of dishes means that you are that much of an outstanding chef. However, a chef isn't completed just because he handles the knife and the pan well. The life of a chef is teamwork. There is a limit to what a chef can make. I believe that you felt that in the last team mission. At that moment, every participant knew by intuition. No, it couldn't be called as intuition. Right now, Alan was blatantly giving away the answer. That the mission that was soon going to start would be a team mission. And their guesses weren't wrong. This mission will be a team mission. You have to separate in 2 teams consisting of 9 people. And just like a normal restaurant, you will need a head chef. At that moment, everyone gulped. You could guess just by looking at their faces. Please, don't let it be me. The head chef seat had more disadvantages than advantages. Because you had to be responsible of everything. It could only be a bothersome seat for amateurs like them. Joseph smiled brightly and walked forward with the box in his hands. There are a total of 18 balls in this box. There is red and blue balls, and the rest are all white. The people that picks a colored ball will be the head chef. I just have to pick a white ball. Jo Min-jun thought like that and nodded. Alan elevated his tone. Come and pick your ball. You will feel more comfortable the earlier you pick your ball. Maybe he was stimulated by those words, but a red-haired youth ran towards the box. It was Jacob. He put his hands in the box with a nervous face. And pulled it out. Alan laughed. A head chef appears from the start. Ah, Jacob looked dumbfoundedly at his hand. And on his hand was a red ball the size of his head. The other participants couldn't help it but feel more relieved. Because, the probability of them becoming the head chef lessened by half. Jo Min-jun asked Kaya, that was next to him. What about you? What? Head chef. Do you want to become one? You know my temperament. That you are fierce. Jo Min-jun asked jokingly. Kaya frowned and shut her mouth. Looking that she wasn't replying meant that she also knew what her character was. Kaya looked at Jo Min-jun and asked. And you? I wonder. Half and half. Honestly, when would you become head chef if not in this situation? That's right. But I still don't want to do it. I will certainly be bad-mouthed. He felt sorry looking at her being uneasy about being bad-mouthed. It seems that the shock she got recently from the broadcast was big. The line kept shortening. Were there at least 5 people that still didn't pick? But even so, the blue ball didn't appear. Kaya looked at Jo Min-jun anxiously. You go first. But I can go and pick a white ball. But, I don't know. I will go. In the end, Kaya went up first. And after a while, there was a blue ball in Kaya's hands. Kaya looked at Jo Minjun resentfully. I told you to go first. The role of the head chef, 1, end translator. Subac proofreader. Mailed.